There comes a moment in every soul's journey when the familiar dissolves into mist, when the well-worn pathways that once carried us through life with such certainty begin to crumble beneath our feet like ancient stone. This is not catastrophe, though it feels like the end of everything we have ever known. This is the sacred disorientation, that profound threshold where the psyche announces, in its mysterious and often terrifying way, that the time for transformation has arrived. In the darkest hour before dawn, when sleep eludes us and we find ourselves staring into the void of our own uncertainty, something stirs in the depths. The compass of certainty that has guided our steps for so long begins to spin, wildly, its needle seeking true north in a landscape that has suddenly become foreign. We reach for the maps we have always trusted, the beliefs, the roles, the identities that have defined us, only to discover that they no longer correspond to the territory we now inhabit. Jung understood this phenomenon with the precision of a master cartographer of the soul. He saw that what appears to the conscious mind as being lost is often the first sign of being found. The ego, that small but fierce guardian of our constructed self, experiences this disorientation as nothing short of apocalyptic. Its desperate clinging to known territories, its frantic attempts to restore the familiar order, are the very forces that must be gently loosened if consciousness is to discover the vast unexplored continents of the self that lie beyond the horizon of our current understanding. This sacred disorientation does not arrive randomly. It emerges when the soul has outgrown the containers that once held it, when the old forms of being can no longer accommodate the expansion that seeks to occur within us. Like a butterfly pressing against the walls of its chrysalis, the authentic self begins to exert pressure against the boundaries of our constructed identity, creating fissures through which new possibilities can enter. The wilderness of confusion in which we find ourselves is not empty wasteland but fertile ground. Here, stripped of our familiar landmarks, we are forced to navigate by different means entirely. The external compass that once pointed toward achievement, approval, or security reveals itself as inadequate for this inner terrain. We must learn to orient ourselves by the subtle pull of something deeper, that inner compass of individuation that Jung recognized as our most reliable guide toward wholeness. In these moments of profound uncertainty, when everything we thought we knew about ourselves seems to be dissolving, we often experience what feels like a death. The ego interprets this dissolution as ultimate threat, marshalling all its defenses against what it perceives as annihilation. Yet this is precisely where Jung's insight penetrates the darkness like a shaft of light. What dies in the sacred disorientation is not the self, but the limitations we have placed upon it. The boundaries we thought protected us have become the very walls that imprison our potential. The disorientation we experience is sacred because it serves the deepest impulse of the psyche toward growth and integration. Like a tree that must weather storms to develop strong roots, the soul requires periods of upheaval to deepen its connection to the underground streams of wisdom that nourish authentic being. When the surface structures of our lives are shaken, we are forced to dig deeper, to find our stability in sources we may never have accessed, while everything seemed secure. There is a peculiar quality to this sacred confusion that distinguishes it from ordinary bewilderment. Beneath the surface anxiety and discomfort lies a strange sense of rightness, as if some part of us recognizes this chaos as necessary. The soul whispers its deepest truth through the very experiences that most disturb the ego, that we are being prepared for something larger than we can currently comprehend, that this apparent dissolution is actually a clearing away of what no longer serves our deepest purpose. Jung observed that the process of individuation, the journey towards psychological wholeness, often begins with just such a sacred disorientation. The persona, that carefully crafted mask we wear in social interactions, starts to feel increasingly artificial. The roles we have played with such dedication begin to chafe against our inner reality, like ill-fitting clothes. The values we inherited from family, culture, and society reveal themselves as second-hand rather than truly our own. This is not a comfortable recognition. The ego, which has invested considerable energy in maintaining these familiar structures, experiences their dissolution as a form of personal failure. We may find ourselves asking devastating questions. Who am I, if not the role I have played so faithfully? What meaning exists if my carefully constructed purpose reveals itself as hollow? Where is solid ground when everything I trusted begins to shift? Yet these questions, difficult as they are, serve as doorways to deeper truth. They force us beneath the surface of our constructed identity to encounter aspects of ourselves that have been waiting in the shadows of consciousness. The sacred disorientation creates space for what Jung called the self, that archetypal core of our being that contains not only who we have been, but who we might become. The wilderness in which we find ourselves during these periods of sacred confusion is not barren, but teeming with potential. Like soil that has been turned and aerated, our consciousness becomes receptive to seeds that could never have taken root in the compacted earth of our previous certainties. New possibilities begin to sprout in the gaps where old assumptions once stood firm. This process requires a fundamental shift in how we understand navigation itself. The external landmarks that once guided our choices, success as measured by society, approval from others, adherence to conventional expectations, prove inadequate for the inner journey that has begun. We must learn to trust subtler indicators. The quiet sense of alignment when we move in a direction that honors our authentic nature, the gentle pull of curiosity toward experiences that nourish our deepest self, the recognition of resonance when we encounter ideas or people that speak to our soul's true language. Jung recognized that this inner compass of individuation operates according to principles quite different from those that govern external achievement. While the ego seeks control, predictability, and confirmation of its existing beliefs, the self moves toward integration, complexity, and the embracing of paradox. What feels like aimless wandering to the conscious mind may actually be the soul's careful exploration of territories that were previously unmappable. The sacred disorientation often manifests in dreams that carry us into landscapes we have never seen, peopled by figures whose faces we cannot quite remember upon waking, but whose presence leaves us with a sense of profound significance. These nocturnal journeys are not random firings of synapses, but carefully orchestrated expeditions into the unconscious territories that hold the keys to our transformation. During the day, this disorientation may appear as a sudden loss of interest in pursuits that once captivated us, or an inexplicable attraction to activities, people, or ideas that seem to have nothing to do with our established identity. The ego rushes to explain these shifts as temporary aberrations, but the soul recognizes them as compass readings from a deeper level of being. There is something profoundly humbling about the sacred disorientation, a recognition that the small self we have constructed is not the architect of our transformation, but rather its grateful recipient. Like pilgrims who must surrender their detailed itineraries to follow the winding paths that actually lead to the sacred sites, we learn to hold our plans lightly, remaining alert to the unexpected invitations that arise when we are truly lost. Jung understood that this willingness to be lost is itself a form of spiritual discipline. It requires the cultivation of what he called active imagination, the capacity to engage consciously with the symbolic material that emerges from the unconscious without trying to immediately categorize or control it. We learn to sit with ambiguity, to find stability in the very experience of not knowing, to trust that confusion itself can be a form of clarity when we stop fighting against it. The sacred disorientation teaches us that true direction emerges not from external maps, but from the inner compass of individuation. This compass does not point toward predetermined destinations, but toward the next necessary step in our unique process of becoming. It guides us not through the territory we think we should traverse, but through the landscape that holds the particular lessons our soul needs to encounter. As we learn to navigate by this inner compass, we discover that what we had taken for solid ground was often merely collective assumption masquerading as truth. The sacred disorientation reveals the difference between the path we thought we were supposed to walk and the path that actually calls to our deepest nature. This revelation can be simultaneously liberating and terrifying, as it requires us to take responsibility for choices that cannot be justified by external authority. The wilderness of confusion in which the sacred disorientation places us is not punishment but preparation. Here, stripped of our familiar orientations, we are forced to develop new capacities: the ability to tolerate uncertainty, the wisdom to distinguish between the voice of ego and the whispers of the self, the courage to follow our authentic impulses, even when they lead us away from conventional success. This preparation is essential because the journey toward individuation requires us to venture into territories that no external guide can map for us. Each soul's path toward wholeness is utterly unique, shaped by the particular constellation of gifts, wounds, and possibilities that define our individual nature. The sacred disorientation serves as a kind of initiatory ordeal, testing our readiness to abandon the safety of collective guidance in favor of the risky but essential work of following our own deep knowing. Jung recognized that this process often involves what appears to be regression, a falling back into confusion, doubt, and apparent meaninglessness. Yet he understood this regression as serving a vital function, creating the psychological conditions necessary for genuine renewal. Like seeds that must decompose in darkness before they can sprout, aspects of our old identity must dissolve completely before new forms of being can emerge. The sacred disorientation marks the beginning of what alchemists called the nigredo, the blackening or putrefaction that constitutes the first stage of transformation. This is not a pleasant process. The comfortable illusions that once provided structure and meaning reveal themselves as insufficient. The roles that once felt like expressions of our true self begin to feel like costumes we can no longer bear to wear. The beliefs that once seemed obviously true start to feel like someone else's ideas we have been carrying without examination. Yet within this apparent dissolution lies the secret of rebirth. The sacred disorientation clears away the accumulated debris of second-hand living, creating space for authentic selfhood to emerge. It forces us to encounter the difference between the life we have been living and the life that seeks to live itself through us. This encounter, difficult as it may be, is the beginning of genuine freedom. As we learn to navigate the wilderness of sacred confusion, we begin to understand that being lost is not the opposite of being found, but rather a necessary stage in the process of discovery. The ego's insistence on always knowing where we are and where we are heading reveals itself as a form of spiritual claustrophobia, keeping us confined to familiar but ultimately limiting territories. The sacred disorientation teaches us to find our footing not on solid ground, but in the very experience of groundlessness itself. We learn to walk on what Buddhists call the pathless path, trusting that each step creates the ground for the next one. This requires a fundamental reorganization of our relationship to security, finding our stability not in external circumstances, but in our growing capacity to remain present and responsive to whatever arises. This shift from external to internal navigation is one of the most challenging aspects of the sacred disorientation. The ego, trained by years of seeking approval and avoiding criticism, struggles to find direction through means that cannot be verified by others. Yet this is precisely what individuation requires: the development of an intimate relationship with our own inner authority, even when, especially when that authority leads us in directions that others cannot understand or approve. The sacred. Disorientation often brings us face to face with the vast difference between the image we have projected to the world and the reality of our inner experience. This confrontation can feel devastating, as if we have been living a lie without realizing it. Yet Jung understood this recognition as profoundly liberating, the first step toward authentic self-expression. When the familiar crumbles beneath our feet and the compass of certainty spins wildly, we are being invited into a more fundamental form of trust, not trust in our ability to control outcomes, but trust in the process of life itself. The sacred disorientation teaches us that we are held by forces far more intelligent and compassionate than our small ego could ever comprehend. We learn to surrender not to defeat, but to a larger choreography, of which our individual transformation is an essential part. The darkness of this disorientation is not empty, but pregnant with possibility. Like the rich darkness of soil from which new growth emerges, or the darkness of the womb, where new life forms. This confusion contains the seeds of whatever seeks to be born through us. Our task is not to illuminate this darkness with the harsh light of premature understanding, but to learn to see with the soul's own luminosity, which reveals not what we expect to find, but what is actually there. In the end, the sacred disorientation reveals itself not as obstacle but as teacher, not as punishment but as initiation into a more authentic way of being. It prepares us for the deeper stages of transformation that lie ahead, developing in us the flexibility, courage, and trust that will be essential as we journey toward the integration and wholeness that Jung recognized as the ultimate goal of human development. Here, in the wilderness of confusion, we begin to glimpse the vast, unexplored continents of the self, where true direction emerges not from external maps, but from the inner compass of individuation that has been waiting all along for us to learn its ancient and reliable language. When the carefully constructed mask we have worn for so long begins to crack and splinter, revealing glimpses of our authentic nature beneath, we stand at one of the most profound thresholds of human awakening. The persona, that elaborate social face we have crafted with such dedication and maintained with such vigilance, suddenly feels foreign against our skin, like a costume that no longer fits the shape we have grown into when no one was watching. Jung understood that the persona serves a vital function in our psychological development, allowing us to navigate the complex social world while our deeper nature slowly ripens in the protected darkness beneath. Like the shell that protects the developing chick, the persona creates a safe boundary between our tender, emerging authenticity and the often harsh demands of collective expectation. Yet there comes a moment when this protective shell becomes a prison, when the very structure that once facilitated our growth now constrains the fullness we seek to express. This is not a gentle process. The cracking of the persona feels like a death to the ego, which has invested enormous energy in perfecting this social presentation. Every compliment we received while wearing this mask, every success achieved through its performance, every relationship built upon its foundation, all of it seems to hang in the balance as fissures spread across the surface of who we thought we were supposed to be. The initial cracks often appear as small inconsistencies, moments when our authentic impulses slip through the careful choreography of social acceptability. We find ourselves speaking words that surprise us, expressing opinions we didn't know we held, or feeling drawn to experiences that seem to have nothing to do with the identity we have so carefully cultivated. The ego rushes to repair these breaks in the facade, but the pressure from beneath continues to build. There is something profoundly archetypal about this process of dissolution, echoing ancient myths of death and rebirth that speak to the deepest patterns of human transformation. Like Inanna descending into the underworld, stripped of her regalia piece by piece, we find ourselves being divested of the ornaments of identity that once defined us. Each layer that falls away feels like a loss, yet beneath each discarded aspect lies something more essential, more true to the core of our being. The fragments of our false selves become compost for the garden where our true nature can finally bloom in its full, magnificent complexity. What appears as breakdown is actually breakthrough, the necessary dismantling of structures that have served their purpose and must now give way to more authentic forms of expression. Yet in the midst of this process, when the familiar self is dissolving and the new self has not yet emerged, we often feel suspended in a terrifying void of undefined being. This liminal space between who we were and who we are becoming requires a fundamental reorganization of our relationship to identity itself. The persona, by its very nature, is static, a fixed presentation designed to meet predictable social expectations. But the authentic self that seeks to emerge is dynamic, responsive, capable of infinite variation and subtle adaptation to the ever-changing landscape of genuine encounter. Jung recognized that the crumbling of the persona often triggers what he called enantiodromia, the tendency of the psyche to swing toward its opposite when any position becomes too rigid or extreme. The person who has maintained a carefully controlled, always appropriate demeanor may suddenly find themselves drawn to wildness, spontaneity, or rebellion. The one who has presented themselves as entirely self-sufficient may discover an unexpected longing for vulnerability and connection. These swings are not signs of instability, but evidence of the psyche's innate wisdom, its drive toward balance and wholeness. As the persona cracks, suppressed aspects of our nature rush toward the surface like water finding its level. The shadow material we banished in order to maintain our acceptable face suddenly demands recognition and integration. This process often manifests in dreams, where we find ourselves naked in public places or wearing clothes that don't fit, or being recognized by strangers who somehow see through our usual disguise. These nocturnal revelations are not punishment but invitation, the unconscious showing us glimpses of the authentic self that has been waiting beneath the social mask for permission to breathe. The crumbling persona brings us face to face with the exhausting nature of constant performance. We begin to recognize how much energy we have been spending on maintaining an image, how much of our vital force has been diverted from authentic self-expression into the careful management of others' perceptions. This recognition can be both liberating and overwhelming, as we realize the extent to which we have been living as actors in our own lives, rather than as genuine protagonists of our unique story. There is a peculiar grief that accompanies the dissolution of the persona, a mourning for the self we thought we were supposed to be. Even when we recognize the limitations and artificiality of our social mask, we may feel profound sadness as it falls away. This grief is natural and necessary. We are saying goodbye to a version of ourselves that may have carried us through difficult periods, that earned us love and acceptance when we needed it most desperately. Yet beneath this grief lies a deeper recognition. The love and acceptance we received while wearing the persona was never truly for us, but for the image we projected. The relationships built on the foundation of false presentation, however well-intentioned, lack the depth and intimacy that become possible when we dare to show our authentic face to the world. As the persona continues to crumble, we often experience what Jung called a regression to childhood. Not a literal return, but a psychological movement towards states of being that existed before we learned to hide our true nature behind social acceptability. We may find ourselves drawn to activities we abandoned when we became serious adults, or rediscovering aspects of our personality that were deemed inappropriate for our chosen role in life. This regression serves a vital function in the process of authentic development. By reconnecting with these earlier, less conditioned aspects of ourselves, we recover energies and capacities that were sacrificed on the altar of social conformity. The playfulness we suppress to appear professional, the sensitivity we harden to seem strong, the creativity we abandon to be practical, all of these return as resources for the more integrated self that seeks to emerge. The crumbling of the persona also reveals the profound difference between adaptation and authenticity. The persona represents our attempt to adapt to external expectations, often at the cost of our genuine nature. But true psychological health requires what Jung called authentic adaptation, the ability to respond genuinely to our environment, while maintaining connection to our essential self. This distinction becomes crucial as we learn to navigate relationships without the protective buffer of persona. When our social mask falls away, we must learn new ways of relating that honor both our authenticity and our need for connection. This requires developing what Jung called differentiated consciousness, the ability to distinguish between our own feelings, thoughts, and impulses and those that belong to others or to the collective. The process of persona dissolution often triggers intense anxiety in those around us. Family members, friends, and colleagues may experience our authenticity as threatening, unpredictable, or selfish. They have grown accustomed to our predictable performance and may unconsciously pressure us to return to the familiar role. This external resistance can feel like evidence that we are making a mistake, but Jung understood it as natural consequence of genuine individuation. The authentic self that emerges as the persona crumbles is not the opposite of social consciousness, but its mature expression. Rather than rejecting all social connection in favor of isolated authenticity, we learn to engage with others from a place of genuine presence rather than calculated performance. This creates the possibility for relationships of unprecedented depth and mutual recognition. There is something profoundly sacred about witnessing the moment when another person's persona begins to crack, when their authentic nature starts to shine through the careful construction of their social self. These glimpses of genuine being are like lightning illuminating a familiar landscape, revealing depths and beauty that were always present but hidden beneath conventional presentation. Our own persona continues to dissolve. We begin to recognize these moments of authenticity in others with increasing sensitivity. We develop what Jung called psychological eyes, the ability to see beyond surface presentations to the essential nature that lies beneath. This capacity for genuine seeing becomes one of the most precious gifts of the individuation process. The symbolic death that occurs when the persona crumbles is not the end of our capacity for social engagement, but its transformation. Instead of relating through fixed roles and predictable presentations, we learn to meet each situation with fresh responsiveness, drawing upon the full range of our authentic capacities rather than limiting ourselves to a narrow band of acceptable behaviors. This process requires developing comfort with being unknown, with surprising both ourselves and others through spontaneous expressions of our deeper nature. The ego, which finds security in predictability, must learn to trust the wisdom of authenticity, even when it leads us into uncharted social territory. We discover that genuine connection often emerges, not despite our authenticity, but because of it. The crumbling persona also reveals the profound creativity that becomes possible when we stop limiting ourselves to predetermined roles. Like jazz musicians who must master traditional forms before they can improvise meaningfully, we needed to learn social conventions before we could transcend them creatively. The authentic self that emerges is not antisocial, but post-conventional, capable of honoring social needs while expressing individual truth. Jung observed that the dissolution of persona often coincides with what he called the confrontation with the shadow, the encounter with those aspects of ourselves that we banished in order to maintain our acceptable image. As the social mask cracks, the rejected material rushes toward consciousness, demanding integration. This can create a period of intense inner turmoil as we struggle to reconcile our idealized self-image with the fuller reality of our complex nature. Yet this confrontation, difficult as it may be, is essential for the development of psychological wholeness. The energy we use to suppress our shadow aspects becomes available for authentic self-expression when we learn to integrate rather than reject these parts of ourselves. The anger we denied, the selfishness we disowned, the vulnerability we hid, all contain essential information about our needs, boundaries, and deepest longings. The crumbling of the persona often triggers what Jung called a creative illness, a period of psychological upheaval that, while distressing, serves as the birthplace for new forms of self-expression. Artists, writers, and innovators often describe periods when their established style or approach suddenly felt inadequate, forcing them to discover new ways of expressing their evolving consciousness. This creative dimension of persona dissolution extends beyond artistic expression to encompass our entire approach to living. As the old patterns of being fall away, we must improvise new ways of meeting each day, each relationship, each challenge. This improvisation requires a fundamental trust in our capacity to respond authentically to whatever arises, even when we cannot predict or control the outcomes. The process of allowing our authentic nature to breathe and emerge through the cracks in our social facade requires what Jung called active patience, the ability to remain present and responsive while allowing natural processes of transformation to unfold in their own timing. We cannot force authenticity any more than we can force a flower to bloom, but we can create conditions that support its natural emergence. These conditions include developing tolerance for the discomfort of being seen without our protective mask, cultivating curiosity about aspects of ourselves we have never allowed to surface, and learning to distinguish between the voice of collective expectation and the whispers of our individual truth. We must also develop the courage to disappoint others when necessary to remain true to ourselves, understanding that temporary conflict often precedes deeper intimacy. As the persona continues to fragment and fall away, we begin to experience moments of profound relief, the exhilaration of breathing without constraint, of speaking without calculation, of moving through the world with the natural grace that emerges when we stop trying to be someone we are not. These moments become touchstones, reminding us that authenticity is not only possible, but essential for genuine aliveness. The garden where our true nature finally blooms reveals itself to be far more magnificent and complex than anything we could have constructed through conscious effort. Like a landscape after a forest fire, cleared of undergrowth and open to new light, our psychological terrain becomes capable of supporting forms of growth that were impossible under the dense canopy of persona maintenance. This blooming is not a single event, but an ongoing process of unfolding as different aspects of our authentic nature emerge in response to changing circumstances and deepening self-knowledge. We discover capacities we never knew we possessed, interests that seem to arise from nowhere, ways of being that feel simultaneously foreign and utterly familiar. The fragments of our false selves, rather than representing loss, become the fertile ground from which genuine selfhood springs. Each discarded aspect of persona creates space for something more real to take root. The energy once devoted to maintaining our image becomes available for authentic creation, genuine relationship, and the ongoing work of individuation that Jung recognized as the central task of human development. In learning to live without the protective shell of persona, we discover that we are far more resilient and resourceful than we ever imagined. The vulnerability we feared would destroy us becomes the very foundation for genuine intimacy. The unpredictability we thought would isolate us becomes the source of creative aliveness that draws others toward authentic connection. The crumbling of the persona marks not an ending, but a beginning, the commencement of a life lived from the inside out, rather than the outside in. As we learn to trust the wisdom of our authentic nature, we begin to understand that the self we are becoming has been waiting all along beneath the carefully constructed surface, patient as seeds in winter soil, ready to burst forth when the conditions are finally right for genuine growth. In the depths, where we have buried our rejected aspects, where the discarded fragments of our wholeness lie waiting in the darkness of the unconscious, the shadow extends its invitation, not to destruction as the ego fears, but to integration and the profound completion that only comes through embracing the totality of what we are. This is perhaps the most paradoxical and transformative stage of the individuation journey, where we must turn toward precisely that which we have spent our lives running from. Jung understood the shadow not as evil incarnate, but as the repository of our unlived life, the treasure house of energies we disowned in our desperate pursuit of social acceptance and moral righteousness. Every quality we deemed unacceptable, every impulse we suppressed for the sake of belonging, every aspect of our nature we sacrificed on the altar of respectability, all of this lives on in the shadow, not as enemy, but as exiled parts of ourselves that contain essential keys to our wholeness. When repressed energies surface unexpectedly, disrupting our carefully controlled existence with raw emotions and unwanted impulses, we receive the first signal that the process of psychological redirection is already underway. The anger we thought we had transcended erupts without warning. The sexuality we believed we had sublimated breaks through our spiritual pretensions. The selfishness we were certain we had overcome reasserts itself with startling force. These are not signs of moral failure, but invitations from the shadow to reclaim what we have lost of ourselves. The shadow's invitation arrives in many forms, often disguised as the very experiences we most wish to avoid. It appears in the person who irritates us beyond all reasonable proportion, carrying in their behavior a mirror of our own rejected qualities that we cannot bear to recognize. It manifests in the dreams that disturb our sleep, populated by dark figures who seem to threaten everything we hold dear about our carefully constructed identity. It emerges in the slip of the tongue that reveals thoughts we didn't know we were, thinking in the sudden impulse that contradicts years of careful self-control. Each of these manifestations carries within it an invitation to what Jung called the alchemical nigredo, the necessary blackening or putrefaction that precedes the emergence of psychological gold. Like the dark phase of the moon that precedes its return to fullness, this descent into the shadow territories of the psyche creates the conditions necessary for genuine renewal and integration. The ego's response to these shadow eruptions is typically one of horror and immediate suppression. It rushes to explain away the unwanted impulses, to distance itself from the uncomfortable recognitions, to restore the familiar order of its moral self-image. Yet this very resistance creates the pressure that ensures the shadow will continue to assert itself with increasing force until we finally accept its invitation to conscious dialogue. Jung revealed that the shadow holds not only our darkness, but our unlived potential, the golden treasures we disowned, not because they were evil, but because they were inconvenient to the image we sought to project. The creativity we abandoned to appear serious and responsible, the wildness we tamed to seem civilized, the fierce protectiveness we softened to appear nice, all of these energies remain available to us through shadow integration. The process of accepting the shadow's invitation requires a fundamental shift in our understanding of morality itself. Rather than the simple division between good and bad that governs conventional ethics, we must learn to navigate the complex landscape of psychological wholeness, where integration becomes more important than purity, and authenticity takes precedence over appearance. This shift is profoundly disorienting for the ego, which has organized its entire identity around being good according to external standards. To acknowledge the shadow is to admit that we contain within ourselves all the qualities we have judged, in others all the potentials we have disowned, all the energies we have declared incompatible with our chosen identity. This recognition can feel like a kind of moral vertigo, as if the ground of our ethical understanding has suddenly become unstable. Yet Jung understood this destabilization as necessary preparation for a more mature and flexible morality, one based not on rigid rules, but on conscious choice informed by deep self-knowledge. When we acknowledge our capacity for selfishness, we can choose generosity with genuine awareness of what we are choosing. When we accept our potential for cruelty, our compassion becomes authentic rather than merely reactive. The shadow's invitation often arrives through what Jung called projection, the unconscious tendency to see in others the qualities we cannot accept in ourselves. The person who triggers our most intense negative reaction is often carrying something that belongs to our own shadow. The qualities that most disturb us in others frequently reflect aspects of ourselves that we have banished from conscious awareness. Learning to withdraw these projections becomes one of the most challenging and rewarding aspects of shadow work. Instead of condemning the other for their behavior, we must ask the difficult question, where does this quality live in me? This does not mean that all negative behavior should be excused or that boundaries are unnecessary, but rather that we approach others with the humility that comes from recognizing our own complexity. The shadow's invitation also arrives through what appears to be our worst impulses, the moments when we act in ways that contradict our self-image and highest aspirations. Rather than simply feeling guilty about these lapses, Jung encouraged us to examine them for the shadow material they might be trying to bring to consciousness.
What need was being expressed through the inappropriate behavior? What energy was seeking recognition through the unwanted impulse? This approach requires developing what Jung called moral imagination, the ability to understand behavior in
terms of the psychological functions it serves, rather than simply judging it as right or wrong. The person who lies compulsively may be protecting a vulnerable truth that feels too dangerous to expose. The one who manipulates others may be expressing a legitimate need for control in an environment where direct assertion feels impossible. The alchemical nigredo that begins with accepting the shadow's invitation is not a pleasant process. It requires us to sit with aspects of ourselves that we have spent years trying to escape. We must learn to tolerate the discomfort of recognizing our capacity for hatred alongside our capacity for love, our potential for destruction alongside our creative gifts, our tendency towards selfishness alongside our genuine concern for others. This tolerance develops slowly through countless small acts of self-acceptance. Each time we acknowledge an unwanted impulse without immediately pushing it away, each time we recognize a shadow quality in ourselves without drowning in shame, each time we extend curiosity rather than judgment toward our darker impulses, we build the psychological muscle necessary for genuine integration. The shadow's invitation is not a call to act out every repressed impulse, but to develop a conscious relationship with the full spectrum of our psychological reality. Integration means neither suppression nor expression, but rather the development of choice informed by deep self-knowledge. When we know our capacity for anger, we can choose how and when to express it constructively. When we acknowledge our selfishness, we can make conscious decisions about when self-care is necessary and when generosity serves our deeper values. Jung observed that the shadow often contains not only our rejected negative qualities, but also our disowned positive ones, what he called the golden shadow. These are the gifts and capacities we rejected, not because they were bad, but because they seemed too dangerous, too powerful, or too far from the modest image we constructed of ourselves. The leadership ability we disowned to avoid responsibility, the creative genius we minimized to fit in with mediocrity, the spiritual insight we dismissed to seem rational, all of these live in the shadow realm, waiting for conscious reclamation. Reclaiming. The golden shadow often proves even more challenging than integrating our darker aspects. It requires us to expand our self-concept beyond the limitations we have accepted, to step into the fullness of our potential, even when doing so might threaten our relationships or challenge our environment. The small self that has learned to hide its light must give way to the larger self that is willing to shine with its full intensity. The shadow's invitation arrives with particular force during midlife, when the persona we have constructed proves insufficient for the psychological tasks that await us in the second half of life. The qualities we rejected in our youth often hold the keys to the wisdom and authenticity that become essential as we age. The rebelliousness we tamed may contain the independence we need to chart our own course. The sensitivity we hardened may hold the empathy necessary for meaningful relationships. This midlife confrontation with the shadow often manifests as what Jung called the midlife crisis, a period when our established way of being suddenly feels inadequate, and we find ourselves drawn to behaviors that seem to contradict everything we have stood for. Rather than pathologizing this process, Jung understood it as the psyche's attempt to restore balance by integrating previously rejected aspects of our nature. The dreams that accompany shadow integration often feature dark figures who initially appear threatening but gradually reveal themselves as guides or allies. These shadow figures in dreams represent the aspects of ourselves that we have relegated to the unconscious, but that continue to influence our behavior from below the threshold of awareness. Learning to dialogue with these figures, to ask what they want and what they offer, becomes a crucial skill in the individuation process. The shadow's invitation extends beyond personal transformation to encompass our relationship with collective darkness as well. Jung recognized that individuals who refuse to acknowledge their personal shadow are more likely to project their darkness onto others, contributing to the scapegoating and demonization that fuel social conflict. By accepting responsibility for our own shadow material, we reduce our contribution to collective unconsciousness. This work requires what Jung called moral courage, the willingness to face the truth about ourselves even when it contradicts our preferred self-image. It means acknowledging that we are capable of the very behaviors we condemn in others, that we contain within ourselves the full spectrum of human possibility, both light and dark. This acknowledgement is not cause for despair, but for humility and compassion. The process of shadow integration transforms our relationship to failure and imperfection. Instead of experiencing our mistakes as evidence of fundamental unworthiness, we begin to see them as information about aspects of ourselves that need attention and integration. The addiction that brings us to our knees may contain important information about needs we have been ignoring. The relationship betrayal that shames us may reveal shadow aspects that require conscious acknowledgement and expression. Jung understood that the shadow's invitation is ultimately an invitation to wholeness, to the kind of completeness that includes rather than excludes, that integrates rather than separates, that embraces the full complexity of human nature rather than settling for partial presentations. This wholeness does not mean perfection, but rather the conscious holding of paradox, the ability to contain contradictory aspects of ourselves without splitting into fragments. The alchemical nigredo, initiated by accepting the shadow's invitation, creates the psychological conditions necessary for what Jung called the conjunctio, the sacred marriage between conscious and unconscious, light and dark, masculine and feminine aspects of the psyche. This integration cannot be achieved through willpower or moral effort, but must emerge naturally from the deep work of acknowledging and embracing what we have rejected. As we learn to dance with our shadow rather than fight against it, we discover energies and capacities that were previously unavailable to us. The anger we were afraid to feel becomes the fierce boundary setting that protects our authentic nature. The selfishness we condemned becomes the healthy self-care that allows us to give from fullness rather than depletion. The sexuality we repressed becomes the creative life force that animates our deepest purposes. The shadow's invitation is not a one-time event, but an ongoing relationship that must be maintained throughout the individuation journey. New shadow. Material emerges as we grow and change, as we encounter new situations that reveal previously unknown aspects of ourselves. The work is never finished, but becomes a way of living that values authenticity over appearance, integration over perfection, wholeness over purity. Through accepting this dark invitation, we discover that the shadow is not our enemy, but our ally in the journey towards psychological completion. It serves as guardian of the energies we need for authentic living, keeper of the gifts we rejected in our pursuit of social acceptance, holder of the wildness and authenticity that make life worth living. In embracing our darkness, we paradoxically discover our light, not the artificial illumination of spiritual pretense, but the natural radiance that emerges when nothing is hidden, nothing is rejected, and everything is allowed to contribute to the magnificent complexity of who we truly are. The golden treasures that emerge from this alchemical blackening are not rewards for enduring the process, but the natural result of psychological honesty and integration. They appear not as foreign additions to our personality, but as the return of capacities that were always ours, energies that we temporarily lost, but never truly owned by anyone else. The shadow's invitation reveals itself in the end, not as a descent into darkness, but as a journey toward the light that can only shine with full intensity when it no longer needs to hide from its own shadow. In the liminal space where meaning and chaos dance their eternal waltz, where the ordered mind meets the wild wisdom of the cosmos, the trickster emerges from the shadows of our carefully constructed reality. This is no gentle awakening, no soft whisper in the cathedral of consciousness. This is the divine disruption that shatters our illusion of control and reveals the magnificent web of interconnection that holds all existence in its invisible embrace. When synchronicities begin to multiply in your life like wildflowers after rain, when the universe starts speaking to you through license plates and overheard conversations, through books falling open to exactly the right page and strangers, who appear bearing precisely the message your soul most needs to hear, know that the trickster has entered your story. This archetypal force, ancient as the first human who looked up at the stars and sensed a pattern beyond comprehension, arrives not to comfort, but to confound, not to confirm your assumptions, but to crack them open like eggs, releasing the golden yolk of deeper truth. Jung understood what our rational age has forgotten, that synchronicity is not the exception but the rule, not coincidence but the very language through which the self communicates with the ego, guiding us toward our destined becoming through a series of meaningful collisions between inner and outer worlds. The trickster is the divine messenger who orchestrates these collisions, the cosmic jester who uses humor and surprise to deliver the most profound teachings, reminding us that the universe is not a machine, but a living story, and we are not separate observers but intimate participants in its unfolding mystery. When you first begin to notice the synchronicities, your logical mind will resist their significance with all the fervor of a fundamentalist defending doctrine. Coincidence, it will insist, wrapping itself in the comfortable blanket of statistical probability and rational explanation. Random occurrence, confirmation bias, pattern-seeking behavior of an evolved primate brain attempting to impose order on chaos. The ego, so desperately invested in maintaining its position as the captain of consciousness, cannot afford to acknowledge that there might be intelligence beyond its comprehension, guidance beyond its control. But the soul recognizes these moments of uncanny connection for what they truly are. Love letters from the cosmos, breadcrumbs on the path toward your authentic destiny, confirmation that you are held and guided by something far more vast and wise than your individual understanding. Each synchronicity is a tap on the shoulder from the universe itself, a gentle but insistent reminder that you are not walking this path alone, that there are forces both within and beyond you, conspiring to bring you into alignment with your deepest purpose. The trickster's wisdom operates through paradox, teaching through contradiction, illuminating truth by first plunging us into delicious confusion. Just when you think you have life figured out, when your plans are perfectly laid, and your path clearly marked, the trickster arrives to shuffle the deck, to introduce the wild card that changes everything. The job opportunity that appears just as you've settled into comfortable resignation. The chance encounter that opens a door you never knew existed. The book that falls into your hands containing exactly the insight needed to unlock the puzzle that has been tormenting your soul. These disruptions are not punishments, but gifts. Not obstacles, but invitations to expand beyond the narrow confines of linear thinking into the multidimensional reality where all things are connected, where past and future dance together in an eternal present, where the smallest action sends ripples across the vast ocean of being. The trickster knows that growth requires discomfort, that wisdom emerges from bewilderment, that the most profound transformations often arrive disguised as unwelcome surprises. Consider the mythology of every culture, and you will find the trickster woven into its foundational stories. Hermes with his winged sandals, dancing between worlds, carrying messages between gods and mortals. Loki of the Norse tradition, shapeshifter and catalyst, whose apparent malice serves the deeper purpose of preventing stagnation in the realm of the gods. Coyote in Native American lore, the fool whose seemingly bumbling mistakes teach the tribe essential survival wisdom. Anansi the spider, weaving stories that contain the secrets of existence itself. These are not mere characters in ancient tales, but living archetypes that continue to operate in the psyche of modern humanity, guiding our evolution through surprise and paradox, teaching us to trust in intelligence that transcends our limited understanding. When the trickster enters your personal mythology, you join an ancient lineage of those who have learned to read the signs, to follow the breadcrumbs, to trust in the wisdom of meaningful coincidence. The synchronicities often begin subtly, like the first drops of rain before a storm. A friend mentions a book, and the next day you see it in a used bookstore window. A song on the radio echoes the exact thought that was just moving through your mind. A number sequence appears repeatedly throughout your day, as if the universe is trying to get your attention through numerical repetition. At first, these moments feel merely curious, interesting enough to mention to friends, but easily dismissed by the rational mind as the inevitable result of heightened awareness. But as you begin to pay attention, as you start to honor these moments, with curiosity rather than skepticism, something remarkable occurs. The synchronicities multiply and intensify, as if your willingness to receive them has opened a floodgate of cosmic communication. The universe, it seems, has been trying to speak to you all along, waiting patiently for you to develop the ears, to hear its subtle language, the eyes to see its intricate patterns, the heart to receive its profound messages. This is when the trickster's true teaching begins to unfold. For synchronicity is not about predicting the future or controlling outcomes. It is about learning to live in partnership with mystery, to navigate by intuition rather than map, to trust in the intelligence of the whole even when the parts seem chaotic and meaningless. The trickster teaches us that meaning is not something we impose upon reality, but something we discover within it, not something we create through analysis, but something we recognize through awareness. Each synchronicity carries within it multiple layers of significance, like a Russian doll of meaning that reveals new treasures with each opening. On the surface level, there is the practical guidance, the person who appears with information you need, the opportunity that emerges at exactly the right moment, the resource that manifests just when you require it most. But beneath this instrumental layer lies something far more profound. Confirmation that you are living in alignment with your soul's purpose. that you are moving in harmony with the deeper currents of existence. The trickster understands that the human psyche needs evidence of its connection to something greater than itself, needs tangible proof that life has meaning beyond the random collision of atomic particles in an indifferent universe. Through synchronicity, we receive this proof not as philosophical argument, but as lived experience, not as belief system, but as direct knowing. When the universe speaks to us through meaningful coincidence, we cannot help but feel held, guided, loved by an intelligence that knows us more intimately than we know ourselves. Yet the trickster's gifts always come wrapped in challenge, its wisdom embedded in confusion. For every synchronicity that confirms our path, there will be another that seems to contradict it. For every sign that points in one direction, there will be another that points elsewhere entirely. This is not cosmic confusion, but cosmic education, teaching us to hold multiple possibilities simultaneously, to embrace uncertainty as the natural state of a life lived in partnership with mystery. The rational mind, trained to seek single solutions and clear answers, struggles with this multiplicity of meaning. It wants to decode the synchronicities like a cryptographer breaking enemy code to extract definitive guidance that can be followed with military precision. But the trickster's wisdom operates through paradox, offering guidance that must be felt rather than analyzed, trusted rather than understood, embodied rather than merely intellectualized. As you deepen into relationship with synchronicity, you begin to understand that you are not a passive recipient of cosmic messages, but an active participant in their creation. Your awareness, your openness, your willingness to engage with mystery becomes part of the very mechanism through which the synchronicities manifest. You discover that you are not separate from the web of meaning, but woven into its very fabric. Not an observer of the cosmic dance, but one of its dancers. This realization brings both exhilaration and responsibility. If you are co-creating the synchronicities through your consciousness, then the quality of your awareness directly influences the quality of the guidance you receive. A mind clouded by cynicism will generate different synchronicities than a heart open to wonder. An ego desperate for control will attract different messages than a soul surrendered to service. The trickster mirrors back to us our own state of being, offering us exactly the experiences we need to grow into greater wholeness. The deepest teaching of the trickster involves the recognition that synchronicity is not separate from ordinary experience, but the hidden dimension within all experience. Every moment contains the potential for meaningful connection. Every encounter carries the possibility of divine message. Every seemingly random event pulses with the intelligence of the whole, seeking to know itself more completely through our individual awareness. When you learn to live with this recognition, when you develop what Jung called eyes to see and ears to hear, the entire world becomes a continuous revelation, a never-ending conversation between your soul and the cosmos. The mundane transforms into the sacred, the random reveals itself as purposeful, and you discover that you are not wandering lost through an indifferent universe, but dancing in partnership with an intelligence so vast and loving that it speaks to you through every leaf that falls, every stranger who smiles, every song that plays at precisely the moment you most need to hear it. This is the trickster's ultimate gift, the restoration of enchantment to a world that has forgotten its magic, the return of meaning to lives that have been drained of purpose by the myth of separation. Through synchronicity, we remember that we are not isolated individuals struggling alone against hostile circumstances, but beloved participants in a cosmic story of awakening, held and guided by forces both within and beyond our comprehension. The trickster laughs at our attempts to capture its essence in words, knowing that its true nature can only be known through direct experience, only be understood through the willingness to be surprised, only be embodied through the courage to trust in what cannot be proven yet feels undeniably true. In the end, the trickster's greatest wisdom is the recognition that wisdom itself cannot be possessed, but only participated in, cannot be achieved, but only received, cannot be mastered, but only danced with in the eternal waltz of meaning and mystery. As you continue on your journey of individuation, carrying the trickster's gifts of synchronicity and surprise, you will discover that every meaningful coincidence is both arrival and departure, both answer and question, both destination and doorway to the next adventure in consciousness. The breadcrumbs that seem to lead to a specific goal reveal themselves to be invitations to an ever-deepening exploration of the mystery you yourself are, the cosmic story you yourself are telling, the divine conversation you yourself are having, with the intelligence that dreams through you and as you in each moment of your magnificent, bewildering, perfectly synchronized existence. From the deepest chambers of the masculine psyche, where dreams are born and intuitions take their first breath, rises a voice that has been waiting centuries to be heard. This is not the voice of reason that dominates the daylight hours of consciousness, not the familiar discourse of logic and analysis that builds empires and solves equations. This is something altogether different, altogether more mysterious. The anima, the inner feminine principle that dwells within every man like a secret garden hidden behind walls of ambition and achievement. When the anima begins to stir, when her whispers first penetrate the armor of masculine certainty, the awakening soul receives an invitation that will forever change the landscape of its existence. For she comes bearing gifts that the rational mind cannot comprehend: the wisdom of relationship, the intelligence of feeling, the profound knowing that life's deepest treasures are found not in conquest, but in connection, not in dominance, but in communion with the sacred feminine mystery that pulses at the heart of existence itself. Jung recognized the anima as far more than a psychological curiosity or theoretical construct. She is the living bridge between the known and the unknown, the conscious and the unconscious, the sterile achievements of ego-driven existence and the fertile valleys where the soul finds its natural habitat. She is the inner beloved who calls us away from the mountaintops of isolated success toward the rivers and meadows where life flows in its natural rhythms, where meaning emerges not from accumulation, but from authentic encounter with the mystery of being. The masculine consciousness, trained from birth to value strength over sensitivity, action over reflection, certainty over wonder, often experiences the anima's emergence as a profound disruption to its carefully ordered world. Here is a voice that speaks in dreams and symbols rather than facts and figures, that values beauty over utility, that finds significance in the subtle movements of the heart rather than the dramatic achievements of the will. Her arrival announces that the one-sided approach to existence, however successful it may appear from the outside, is no longer sufficient for the soul's continued evolution. When the anima begins to speak, she often arrives first in dreams, weaving through the nocturnal landscape of the unconscious like a figure from a half-remembered fairy tale. She might appear as the wise woman who offers cryptic guidance, the lover who awakens longings that transcend physical desire, the mother who nurtures aspects of the self that have been neglected and forgotten. These dream encounters carry a quality of numinous intensity that lingers long after waking, haunting the edges of consciousness with their beauty and their challenge. But the anima's influence extends far beyond the realm of sleep and symbol. She is the sudden urge to write poetry in the middle of a board meeting, the unexpected tears that arise while watching a sunset, the growing dissatisfaction with relationships that exist only on the surface level of shared activities and mutual benefit. She is the voice that whispers, "There must be more than this," when success feels hollow, when achievement leaves the heart empty, when the masculine drive toward accomplishment encounters the wall of its own limitations. Her awakening often coincides with what the world might label a midlife crisis, though this term barely captures the profound spiritual significance of her emergence. She represents not a crisis, but a correction, not a breakdown, but a breakthrough, not the failure of masculine strength, but its evolution towards something more complete and more genuinely powerful. When the anima rises, she brings with her the recognition that true strength includes the capacity for vulnerability, that genuine power encompasses the ability to receive as well as to give, that authentic leadership requires the wisdom of the heart as well as the clarity of the mind. The resistance to her influence can be fierce, for the masculine ego has invested decades in building its identity around the suppression of everything she represents. To acknowledge her wisdom means questioning the very foundations upon which the masculine sense of self has been constructed. It means admitting that the qualities labeled as weakness by a patriarchal culture, sensitivity, intuition, emotional depth, relational intelligence, are actually essential components of a fully realized human being. This resistance often manifests as the projection of the anima onto external women, seeking in the outer world what can only be found within. The man, caught in this projection, becomes dependent on women to carry his own undeveloped feminine nature, expecting them to provide the beauty, feeling, and soulful meaning that he has exiled from his own consciousness. He may idealize women as goddesses or demonize them as temptresses, but in either case, he remains unconscious of the inner feminine voice that seeks recognition and integration within his own psyche. The journey toward conscious relationship with the anima requires a fundamental shift in how the masculine consciousness understands itself and its purpose in the world. It demands the courage to embrace qualities that may have been ridiculed or dismissed throughout his formative years, to value experiences that cannot be measured in terms of external achievement, to honor ways of knowing that transcend rational analysis. As this inner feminine voice grows stronger, she begins to influence every aspect of life with her distinctive wisdom. She teaches that relationships are not strategic alliances, but sacred encounters, that success without soul satisfaction is ultimately meaningless, that the highest achievements are those that serve not just personal ambition, but the greater good of all life. She brings the recognition that the feminine principle is not the opposite of the masculine, but its completion, not its enemy, but its essential partner in the dance of wholeness. The anima speaks the language of symbol and metaphor, communicating through synchronicities and sudden insights rather than logical arguments. She might express herself through an unexpected attraction to art or music, a growing appreciation for natural beauty, an increasing need for solitude and reflection. She may manifest as a longing for deeper spiritual connection, a desire to mentor or nurture others, a pull toward creative expression that has nothing to do with profit or recognition. Her influence often brings a profound reordering of priorities, a shift from the external focus of achievement to the internal work of soul development. The man who has spent his life climbing ladders of success may find himself questioning what he is actually climbing toward. The executive who has mastered the art of strategic thinking may discover a yearning for authentic connection that cannot be satisfied through networking and deal-making. The warrior who has defined himself through conquest may hear the call to become a gardener of consciousness, cultivating growth rather than claiming victory. This transformation is rarely smooth or linear. The anima's emergence often brings periods of confusion and disorientation as the familiar structures of masculine identity begin to soften and reshape themselves. There may be times of profound melancholy as the soul grieves for all the beauty and connection that was sacrificed in service of a one-dimensional vision of success. There may be periods of anger as the man recognizes how his own feminine nature was suppressed not only by external forces, but by his own internalization of cultural conditioning. Yet these difficult passages are necessary labors in the birth of a more complete self. The anima does not seek to eliminate the masculine qualities, but to balance them, not to replace strength with weakness, but to reveal that true strength includes the capacity for tenderness, not to abandon achievement, but to ensure that accomplishment serves the deeper purposes of the soul. As the relationship with the anima deepens, she becomes less of a disruptive force and more of a trusted advisor, offering her unique perspective on every aspect of life. She teaches the value of process, over product, relationship over result, being overdoing. She shows that leadership is most effective when it includes the feminine qualities of empathy, intuition, and collaborative wisdom. She demonstrates that creativity flows most freely when it is not forced but allowed, not driven but invited. The ice, man who learns to listen to his anima, discovers resources within himself that he never knew existed. He finds that he can make decisions not only through rational analysis, but through felt sense, that he can navigate complex situations not only through strategic thinking, but through intuitive wisdom. He learns that his capacity for relationship deepens exponentially when he brings his own emotional authenticity to the encounter rather than expecting others to carry all the feeling. Most profoundly, the awakened anima teaches that the ultimate goal of human development is not individual success, but conscious participation in the greater web of life. She whispers that every achievement is hollow if it does not serve the flourishing of the whole, that every relationship is incomplete if it does not honor the sacred nature of the encounter, that every day is wasted if it does not include moments of wonder, beauty, and authentic connection with the mystery that surrounds and interprets all existence. The voice of the anima, once fully integrated into consciousness, becomes a source of continuous guidance and inspiration. She is the inner compass that points not toward external rewards, but toward soul satisfaction, the internal gauge that measures not just what is possible, but what is meaningful, the sacred feminine wisdom that ensures that the masculine drive toward manifestation serves the highest purposes of love, beauty, and conscious evolution. In the end, the awakening of the anima represents nothing less than the restoration of wholeness to a consciousness that has been living in exile from half of its own nature. She brings the recognition that the human soul is not meant to be divided against itself, that the sacred marriage between masculine and feminine principles is not something that happens only in external relationships, but must first be consummated within the temple of individual consciousness. Through her voice, the soul remembers its completeness, reclaims its capacity for both strength and tenderness, and steps forward into a life of authentic power that serve not only personal fulfillment, but the evolution of consciousness itself. Within the sacred chambers of the feminine psyche, where intuition flows like underground rivers and wisdom gestates in the darkness of the unconscious, something stirs that has been sleeping for centuries. This is not the gentle awakening of dawn breaking over familiar landscapes, but the thunderous rising of a forgotten king from the depths of the soul, the animus, the inner masculine principle that carries within its awakening the sword of discrimination and the fire of spiritual quest. When the animus begins to stir within the feminine consciousness, the very foundations of identity tremble with both terror and anticipation. For here is a force that challenges everything the feminine soul has been taught about her place in the world, her role in relationship, her capacity for power and authority. Here is the inner masculine voice that refuses to be silenced by cultural conditioning, that will not be diminished by centuries of suppression, that rises like a phoenix from the ashes of patriarchal diminishment, to reclaim its rightful place in the landscape of consciousness. Jung understood the animus as far more than the simple complement to the masculine anima. He recognized this archetypal force as the carrier of the feminine soul's deepest longing for wholeness, the internal masculine energy that must be awakened and integrated if woman is to step into her full power as a complete human being. The animus is not the enemy of feminine nature, but its essential partner, not the betrayal of feminine wisdom, but its necessary completion. The sleeping king within begins his awakening slowly, often appearing first in dreams as figures of authority and power. The wise teacher who challenges outdated beliefs, the warrior who calls for courage in the face of opposition, the lover who demands authentic expression rather than people-pleasing performance. These nocturnal visitations carry a quality of urgent summons, as if something within the psyche is preparing for a great battle, gathering its forces for a campaign of liberation that will reshape the entire inner landscape. But the animus does not remain confined to the realm of sleep and symbol. His awakening announces itself through a growing dissatisfaction with relationships built on inequality, through an increasing impatience with situations that demand the sacrifice of authentic voice for the comfort of others. He is the sudden surge of clarity that cuts through emotional confusion, the unexpected strength that emerges in moments of crisis, the fierce protectiveness that arises when core values are threatened or violated. When the animus awakens, women begin to feel the stirring of what their culture has systematically taught them to fear: their own authority, their own power, their own capacity to discriminate between what serves their highest good and what diminishes their essential nature. This is the inner masculine voice that says no more to exploitation disguised as love, that refuses to carry the emotional burdens of others at the expense of their own soul development, that claims the right to speak truth even when that truth makes others uncomfortable. The cultural resistance to this awakening can be intense, for the emergence of the feminine animus threatens the very foundations of patriarchal structure that depends upon women remaining unconscious of their own inner masculine power. A woman who has integrated her animus can no longer be manipulated through guilt or controlled through the withdrawal of approval. She becomes dangerous to systems that require feminine compliance, threatening to structures that depend upon women accepting secondary status in their own lives. This resistance often manifests first within the woman herself, through the internalized voices of cultural conditioning that whisper seductive warnings about the dangers of claiming too much power, speaking too boldly, taking up too much space. The inner critic, carrying the voice of patriarchal judgment, warns that embracing the animus will lead to rejection, abandonment, the loss of love and acceptance. Be careful, it whispers. You are becoming too strong, too independent, too much. But the awakening animus refuses to be silenced by these fears. He carries within his essence the fierce love that protects what is sacred, the discriminating wisdom that recognizes the difference between authentic relationship and emotional manipulation, the spiritual fire that burns away everything that is not aligned with the soul's highest truth. He is not the destroyer of feminine nature, but its guardian, not the enemy of love, but its fierce protector. As the animus emerges more fully into consciousness, he begins to reshape every aspect of the feminine experience with his transformative presence. He teaches that receptivity does not require passivity, that nurturing does not demand self-sacrifice, that love does not mean accepting abuse or diminishment. He brings the recognition that the feminine soul possesses not only the capacity to receive and hold, but also the power to discern and direct, to create boundaries and enforce them, to say yes to what serves life and no to what destroys it. The integration of the animus often coincides with what appears to others as a midlife transformation, though this timing reflects not chronological age, but the soul's readiness to reclaim its wholeness. Women in the grip of animus awakening may suddenly find themselves questioning relationships that have lasted decades, challenging authority figures they have previously obeyed without question, speaking truths that have been buried beneath years of accommodation and compromise. This can be a terrifying time for those around the awakening woman, particularly those who have benefited from her unconscious state. Partners who have grown comfortable with inequality may resist her growing demands, for authentic partnership. Children who have relied on her endless giving may struggle with her new boundaries. Friends who have enjoyed her constant availability may feel abandoned by her growing selectivity about how she spends her precious time and energy. Yet, the awakening animus brings not destruction, but discrimination, not cruelty, but clarity. He teaches the feminine soul to love from a place of fullness rather than emptiness, to give from overflow rather than depletion, to serve from choice rather than compulsion. He shows that the highest form of nurturing is teaching others to access their own inner resources, that the deepest love sometimes requires saying difficult truths, that authentic care includes the willingness to allow others to experience the consequences of their choices. The animus carries within his essence the archetypal energy of the spiritual quest, the drive toward meaning that transcends the merely personal realm of relationship and family. When he awakens, women often find themselves called to adventures that extend far beyond the traditional boundaries of feminine concern. They may feel drawn to study philosophy or theology, to engage in political activism, to pursue creative endeavors that express universal rather than merely personal themes. This expansion of interest and ambition can create profound internal conflict for women who have been raised to believe that their primary purpose is the care and nurturing of others. The animus whispers that they too have souls worthy of development, minds capable of grappling with the great questions of existence, spirits that yearn for direct connection with the divine mystery. He challenges the cultural assumption that feminine fulfillment can only be found through relationship with others, suggesting instead that the most important relationship is the one with the self. The sword of discrimination that the animus carries is perhaps his most challenging gift, for it requires the feminine consciousness to develop the capacity for what may appear to be harshness, but is actually fierce love. This is the sword that cuts away illusion, that severs connections that have become toxic, that refuses to enable destructive behavior in the name of compassion. It is the blade that carves out space for authentic expression, that protects the sacred flame of individuality from being extinguished by the demands of others. Learning to wield this sword requires tremendous courage, for it means accepting that love sometimes requires conflict, that peace bought through self-betrayal is no peace at all, that the highest service may involve refusing to serve. The awakening woman must learn to tolerate the discomfort of others' displeasure, to stand firm in her truth even when standing alone, to trust her inner knowing even when it contradicts the opinions of those she has previously deferred to without question. The fire of spiritual quest that burns within the awakened animus transforms the feminine relationship to power itself. No longer is power something that belongs exclusively to the masculine realm, something that women can access only through manipulation or seduction. The animus teaches that feminine power is not derivative but original, not borrowed but inherent, not dependent on others' permission but arising naturally from the depths of authentic being. This realization brings both exhilaration and responsibility. The woman who has awakened to her own inner masculine power can no longer claim victimhood, as her primary identity can no longer blame others for the choices she makes or fails to make. She must step forward into the arena of conscious creation, taking full responsibility for the life she builds, the relationship she chooses, the legacy she leaves behind. The awakened animus also brings a profound shift in how the feminine consciousness relates to conflict and competition. Rather than seeing these as threats to be avoided or forces that diminish her essential nature, she begins to understand them as opportunities for growth, challenges that strengthen her capacity for authentic expression. She learns that she can engage in intellectual combat without losing her heart, that she can compete without betraying her collaborative nature, that she can stand strong in her convictions without becoming rigid or dogmatic. Perhaps most importantly, The integration of the animus teaches the feminine soul that her receptive depths and her dynamic creative power are not opposing forces but complementary aspects of her divine nature. She discovers that her capacity to hold space and her ability to take action are both expressions of the same essential wholeness, that her gift for nurturing and her power to discriminate serve the same ultimate purpose of protecting and fostering life in all its forms. The awakened animus becomes a trusted counselor in navigating the complex terrain of modern existence, offering his unique perspective on every challenge and opportunity. He teaches strategic thinking without losing touch with intuitive wisdom, encourages bold action while maintaining connection to feeling truth, supports ambitious endeavors while ensuring they serve the soul's deepest values. Women who have successfully integrated their animus discover that they possess resources within themselves that they never imagined existed. They find that they can make decisions not only from the heart, but from the head, that they can navigate complex situations through both emotional intelligence and strategic thinking. They learn that their capacity for leadership expands exponentially when they bring both their feminine wisdom and their masculine clarity to bear on the challenges they face. The fully awakened animus teaches that the ultimate goal of feminine development is not the replacement of receptivity with activity, but the conscious marriage of both principles within the temple of individual consciousness. He shows that the sacred feminine is not diminished by the inclusion of masculine qualities, but completed by them, not threatened by strength, but empowered by it, not betrayed by discrimination, but protected by it. In the end, the awakening of the animus represents nothing less than the restoration of the complete woman, the feminine being who embodies both the ancient wisdom of receptivity and the timeless power of directed will, who serves life not through self-diminishment, but through the full expression of her multifaceted nature. Through his awakening, the feminine soul remembers that she was never meant to be half of anything, but was always intended to be a whole human being, complete within herself, capable of both receiving and giving, of following and leading, of nurturing and protecting the sacred flame of consciousness that burns at the heart of existence itself. In the depths of the human psyche, where light meets shadow and consciousness encounters the vast unknown territories of the unconscious, there exists a sacred alchemical laboratory. Here, in this liminal space that belongs neither to the rational mind nor to the wild unconscious alone, Carl Jung discovered one of his most profound insights, the transcendent function. This is not merely a psychological concept to be understood intellectually, but a living reality that each soul must experience directly, a mysterious bridge that spans the chasm between opposing forces within us. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a great canyon where two worlds meet yet seem impossibly separated. On one side lies everything you have come to know as yourself, your conscious thoughts, your carefully constructed beliefs, your familiar patterns of behavior, the persona you have crafted to navigate the world. This is the realm of the known, the territory mapped by your ego, illuminated by the bright torch of rational awareness. Yet across this vast divide stretches another landscape entirely, shrouded in mist and mystery, where dwell the rejected aspects of your being, the unlived possibilities, the wisdom your conscious mind has dismissed or feared to acknowledge. Between these two realms flows not empty space, but a dynamic field of creative tension, a psychological crucible where the impossible becomes possible. The transcendent function emerges precisely in this space of apparent contradiction, this place where opposing forces meet not to destroy each other, but to give birth to something entirely new. It is the psyche's innate capacity to create a third option, a synthesis that honors the truth contained in both sides while transcending the limitations of either alone. When we find ourselves caught in the grip of an impossible choice, suspended. Between conflicting desires that seem to tear at the very fabric of our being, we have entered the sacred precinct where transformation occurs. Perhaps you recognize this terrain, the mother who feels equally called to career ambition and complete devotion to her children, the artist who longs both for creative solitude and meaningful connection, the seeker who feels drawn equally to mystical transcendence and embodied earthly engagement. These are not simply problems to be solved through clever analysis or willful decision-making, but invitations to participate in the mystery of psychological birth. The transcendent function operates according to principles that Jung discovered mirror the ancient art of alchemy. The medieval alchemists, in their quest to transform base metals into gold, unknowingly mapped the territory of inner transformation. Their fundamental principle of solver et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, reveals the essential movement of psychological change. First, the old structures must be dissolved. The rigid patterns that once served us must be allowed to liquefy, to lose their fixed form. This dissolution can feel like death itself, for we are allowing cherished aspects of our identity to melt away, to return to the primordial waters of possibility. Yet this death is not an ending, but a sacred preparation for rebirth. In the alchemical vessel of the psyche, as the old forms dissolve, new possibilities begin to crystallize. This is the coagulatio, the mysterious process by which something entirely unprecedented takes shape from the marriage of opposites. The transcendent function acts as the divine catalyst in this inner alchemy, the mysterious agent that facilitates the impossible union of elements that logic declares incompatible. Consider the profound tension that arises when we find ourselves simultaneously drawn to security and adventure, to solitude and community, to tradition and innovation. The ego, trained in the logic of either-or, insists we must choose one path and abandon the other. It presents us with false dichotomies, demanding we split ourselves in half, sacrificing vital aspects of our nature on the altar of consistency. Yet the transcendent function whispers a different possibility. What if both truths could be honored in a way we have not yet imagined? This is not the compromise of the middle ground, which often satisfies neither side of our nature, but rather an ascent to a higher level of being, where apparent contradictions reveal themselves as complementary aspects of a greater wholeness, like a spiral staircase that allows us to occupy the same coordinates at different levels of height. The transcendent function lifts us to a vantage point from which our previous dilemma appears not as an irreconcilable conflict, but as the creative tension necessary for our next stage of development. The process begins with what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites. This requires a profound act of psychological courage, the willingness to remain present to conflicting impulses without immediately rushing toward resolution. In our culture of quick fixes and instant gratification, this capacity for sustained uncertainty feels almost revolutionary. We are asked to become like the alchemical vessel itself, strong enough to contain intense pressure without cracking, flexible enough to accommodate transformation without breaking. In this holding, something miraculous begins to occur. The opposites that seem so incompatible start to reveal their secret kinship. The fierce independence we thought contradicted our need for intimacy begins to show us how sovereignty actually enables deeper connection. The practical responsibilities we imagined opposed to our creative dreams reveal how structure can become the very foundation that allows inspiration to take form. The spiritual longings we believed at odds with material engagement demonstrate how the sacred is discovered not by fleeing the world, but by entering it more fully. This is the mystery Jung called the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites, that occurs in the depths of the psyche when we cease trying to force resolution through the narrow corridors of rational analysis. Instead, we learn to trust the deeper intelligence of the unconscious, the wisdom that operates according to different laws, than those governing our everyday awareness. We discover that the psyche itself is far more creative than our conscious minds, capable of solutions that honor complexity rather than simplifying it away. The transcendent function often announces itself through unexpected symbols, images that arise spontaneously in dreams, meditation, or moments of quiet reflection. These symbolic bridges carry meanings that cannot be fully translated into rational language, yet speak directly to the soul's understanding. A dream of flying might emerge precisely when we feel most earthbound, offering not escape but a new perspective on our situation. An image of water flowing around seemingly immovable stones suggests ways our life force can find its course without destroying what appeared to block it. These symbols function as messengers from the deeper layers of the psyche, bringing news from territories where the laws of logical contradiction do not apply. In the symbolic realm, we can simultaneously be the seeker and the found, the teacher and the student, the wounded healer who discovers strength through vulnerability. The transcendent function operates through this symbolic language because symbols alone can carry the full complexity of psychological truth without reducing it to oversimplified concepts. Yet this process is not merely passive waiting for symbolic inspiration. The transcendent function requires our active participation, our willingness to engage consciously with the unconscious contents that arise. This is what Jung meant by active imagination, the discipline of dialoguing with the images, figures, and scenarios that emerge from the depths of our psyche. We learn to ask questions of our dreams, to engage in conversation with the inner figures who appear in our fantasies, to treat the products of our imagination not as mere curiosities, but as communications from aspects of ourselves seeking integration. Through this conscious engagement with unconscious content, we become co-creators in our own transformation. We are no longer passive victims of conflicting impulses, but active participants in the birth of new possibilities. The transcendent function reveals itself as both gift and responsibility, a natural capacity of the psyche that nonetheless requires our conscious cooperation to unfold fully. This cooperation often demands that we develop what Jung called a symbolic attitude toward life, the ability to perceive the deeper meanings embedded in our experiences, to recognize the archetypal patterns playing out through our personal circumstances. When we can see our conflicts not merely as problems to be solved, but as expressions of eternal human themes seeking resolution through our particular lives, we align ourselves with forces far greater than our individual will. The mother torn between career and children begins to recognize in her struggle the ancient tension between the archetypal mother and the archetypal Amazon, both vital expressions of feminine power that need not cancel each other out. The artist, divided between solitude and community, perceives the universal dance between the hermit and the lover, each requiring the other for complete expression. Through this symbolic lens, our personal dilemmas reveal themselves as participation in the great ongoing work of human consciousness itself. This recognition transforms our relationship to conflict from something to be feared and quickly resolved to something to be honored as the very engine of growth. We begin to understand that the tension of opposites is not a sign that something is wrong with us, but evidence that we are alive to the full spectrum of human possibility. The psyche creates these conflicts not to torture us, but to invite us into greater wholeness, to call forth capacities we did not know we possessed. The transcendent function operates according to its own timing, which rarely aligns with our ego's preference for immediate clarity. Like the slow processes of nature, the gradual metamorphosis of the caterpillar, the patient formation of pearls within the oyster's depths, psychological transformation unfolds according to organic rhythms that cannot be hurried without damaging the delicate work being accomplished in the depths. This requires learning to trust what Jung called the wisdom of the unconscious, the deep intelligence that orchestrates our dreams, synchronizes meaningful coincidences, and guides the slow work of becoming whole. We discover that the unconscious is not merely a repository of repressed material, as Freud suggested, but a creative partner in the work of individuation, constantly offering resources for growth and healing that our conscious minds could never devise alone. Yet this trust must be balanced with conscious discernment, for not every impulse from the unconscious serves our highest development. The transcendent function requires what the alchemists called the discriminating intelligence, the ability to separate what serves our authentic growth from what merely feeds our neuroses and complexes. We learn to distinguish between the voice of genuine inspiration and the seductive whispers of our unhealed wounds seeking to repeat familiar patterns. This discrimination develops through experience, through the patient practice of following inner promptings and observing their fruits. In our lives, we discover that the authentic voice of the transcendent function has certain qualities. It tends to expand rather than contract our sense of possibility, to increase rather than diminish our capacity for love, to deepen rather than escape our engagement with life. While it may initially seem to complicate our choices, its ultimate direction is toward greater simplicity, the elegant solutions that emerge when apparent complexity resolves into profound coherence. As we learn to work consciously with the transcendent function, we begin to recognize its activity in retrospect throughout our lives. We remember times when seemingly impossible situations resolved themselves through unexpected developments, when new paths opened precisely when all familiar routes seemed blocked, when our greatest failures mysteriously became doorways to our most authentic successes. We realize that this mysterious process has been working through us all along, even when we were unaware of its presence. This recognition brings both humility and empowerment. Humility because we see how much of our development has been guided by wisdom beyond our conscious understanding, and empowerment because we realize we can learn to cooperate more fully with this process rather than working against it. We begin to see our lives not as random sequences of events we must control through willpower alone, but as meaningful unfolding guided by intelligence that encompasses yet transcends our personal awareness. The transcendent function reveals the psyche as inherently creative, constantly generating new possibilities from the raw material of our experiences, conflicts, and contradictions. What appears as psychological deadlock from the perspective of either-or thinking becomes, through the lens of the transcendent function, the very condition necessary for breakthrough to higher levels of integration. This process often involves what Jung called circumambulation, the patient circling around a problem or conflict, approaching it from multiple angles rather than trying to attack it directly. Like pilgrims walking the labyrinth, we discover that the path to resolution is not straight, but spiral, taking us through seemingly repetitive cycles that actually carry us deeper into understanding with each revolution. Through this circular movement, we gradually develop the capacity to hold larger amounts of tension, to remain present to contradiction, without immediately seeking escape through premature closure. We learn that some of life's most important questions cannot be answered through linear thinking, but must be lived into over time, allowing their solutions to emerge through the slow alchemy of experience. The transcendent function teaches us that consciousness itself is not a static achievement, but a dynamic process, constantly evolving through the creative encounter between known and unknown, conscious and unconscious, personal will and transpersonal wisdom. We are not fixed entities struggling against immutable circumstances, but creative processes continuously reshaping ourselves through conscious engagement with the forces of transformation. This understanding fundamentally alters our relationship to difficulty and uncertainty. Instead of viewing challenges as obstacles to our happiness or evidence of our inadequacy, we begin to recognize them as invitations to participate more fully in the great work of becoming conscious. Each conflict becomes a potential crucible for the birth of new capacities, each apparent contradiction a doorway to expanded awareness. In the sacred laboratory of the psyche, where the transcendent function performs its mysterious alchemy, we discover that we are both scientist and subject, observer and observed, creator and creation. We learn to trust the process even when we cannot see its ultimate destination, to participate fully in our own transformation while surrendering the illusion that we can control its outcome through force of will alone. The transcendent function ultimately reveals individuation not as a process of perfecting the ego, but as a progressive surrender to the deeper intelligence of the self, that archetypal image of wholeness that Jung recognized as the guiding principle of psychological development. Through countless encounters with the tension of opposites, through patient cooperation with the creative processes of the unconscious, we gradually align our conscious will with this greater wisdom, becoming vehicles through which the self can manifest its unique pattern in the world. This is the ultimate gift of the transcendent function, not merely the resolution of our personal conflicts, but our participation in the larger creative process through which consciousness evolves. We discover that our individual journey toward wholeness is simultaneously a contribution to the collective work of human development, that by becoming more fully ourselves, we serve something far greater than our personal satisfaction. In learning to trust and work with the transcendent function, we become conscious participants in the great mystery of becoming, co-creators in the ongoing birth of new possibilities from the marriage of opposites that dwells forever in the depths of the human soul. Deep within the architecture of every human soul lies a summons that cannot be ignored forever, a call that echoes through the chambers of our being with increasing urgency as we move through the passages of life. This is the call to individuation, Jung's term for the most sacred journey any person can undertake. The courageous movement away from the comfortable conformity of collective expectations toward the discovery and embodiment of our unique, authentic essence. Like the ancient heroes whose stories have captivated humanity across millennia, Odysseus, drawn by an irresistible longing toward home, Psyche compelled to seek her lost love through impossible trials, the Buddha abandoning his palace to discover the source of human suffering, we too receive this unmistakable invitation to adventure. It arrives not as a gentle suggestion we might politely decline, but as an imperative that grows stronger each time we attempt to dismiss it. A persistent voice from the depths that refuses to be silenced by our rational explanations of why such a journey seems impractical or impossible. At first, this call may manifest as a subtle but persistent sense of unease, a growing feeling that the life we have constructed, however successful by external measures, somehow fails to capture the fullness of who we are meant to be. We find ourselves increasingly unable to find satisfaction in achievements that once brought pride, increasingly uncomfortable in roles that once fit like well-tailored clothing but now feel restrictive, even suffocating. The career that consumed our 20s with passionate dedication begins to feel hollow. The relationships that once defined our sense of worth start to chafe against something essential that demands expression. This is not the crisis of ingratitude or selfish dissatisfaction that our critics might suggest, nor is it evidence of our failure to appreciate the blessings we have received. Rather, it signals the stirring of something far more profound, the self, that archetypal image of wholeness that Jung recognized as the guiding principle of human development, beginning to assert its claims upon our conscious attention. The self is not content to remain forever hidden beneath the accumulated layers of social conditioning, professional identities, and inherited expectations. Like a seed that has gathered sufficient energy to break through the soil toward the light, our authentic nature begins to push against the constraints that once protected, but now impede its growth. The process of individuation begins with what, Jung called the dissolution of the persona, that carefully constructed mask we wear to navigate the social world, to meet others' expectations, to secure our place within the collective structures of family, career, and community. The persona serves essential functions, particularly in the first half of life, when we must establish ourselves in the outer world, develop necessary skills, and learn to function effectively within society's framework. Yet what serves us well in youth can become a prison in maturity if we mistake this adaptive facade for our true identity. The call to individuation announces that the time has come to distinguish between who we have learned to be and who we actually are beneath all the accumulated layers of conditioning. This distinction requires tremendous courage, for it asks us to question not only the expectations of others, but our own cherished self-concepts, to examine whether the person we have become reflects our authentic nature or merely our successful adaptation to circumstances that may no longer serve our deepest development. This questioning process often begins with what appears to be external dissatisfaction, but reveals itself as an internal revolution. We may find ourselves increasingly unable to tolerate superficial conversations, drawn instead toward discussions of meaning and depth that leave others uncomfortable. We might discover that activities once enjoyed now feel empty, while pursuits we had dismissed as impractical or inappropriate begin to call to us with unexpected intensity. The reliable formulas for happiness that worked in earlier stages of life suddenly seem inadequate to address the soul's expanding requirements. These changes can be deeply disturbing not only to ourselves, but to those around us who have grown, accustomed to our predictable patterns, who have built their own sense of security partly upon our consistency. Family members may express concern that we are going through a phase or having a midlife crisis. Friends might worry that we are making decisions that will jeopardize our stability or status. Colleagues could question our commitment to shared goals that once seemed unquestionable. In their concern, they are reflecting the collective's instinctive resistance to individuation. For a person beginning to follow their authentic path inevitably challenges others to examine the authenticity of their own choices. Yet, to heed the I call to individuation is not to reject all external obligations or to pursue selfish desires without regard for their impact upon others. True individuation actually increases our capacity for genuine relationship and meaningful contribution, for it frees us from the exhausting effort of maintaining false personas and allows us to offer our authentic gifts to the world. The process asks not that we abandon all responsibilities, but that we distinguish between obligations that spring from our authentic values and those imposed by unconscious patterns of people-pleasing, fear, or societal pressure. This discrimination between authentic and inauthentic obligations requires developing what Jung called the relationship between ego and self. The ego, our conscious sense of identity, our capacity for choice and action in the world, must learn to serve not its own narrow preferences or the expectations of others, but the deeper pattern of wholeness represented by the self. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of individuation, for it requires surrendering the ego's illusion of absolute autonomy while simultaneously claiming responsibility for our unique path of development. The relationship between ego and self is not one of domination, but of dialogue, not subjugation, but conscious cooperation. The ego learns to listen for the subtle promptings of the deeper self, to recognize the difference between the self's authentic guidance and the ego's fearful projections or wishful fantasies. This listening requires developing what might be called an inner ear, the capacity to discern the quiet voice of wisdom beneath the louder clamoring of societal expectations, family pressures, and our own complexes and neuroses. The self speaks, not through dramatic proclamations, but through gentle persistencies. The book that continues to call our attention, despite our protestations that we have no time to read. The creative project that keeps returning to our thoughts, despite our certainty that we lack the necessary talents, the relationship possibility that intrigues us despite our conviction that it makes no practical sense. The self's communications often arrive through what Jung called synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that seem to offer guidance or confirmation precisely when we most need direction. Learning to recognize and trust these subtle communications from the self requires developing a different relationship to uncertainty and risk. The path of individuation rarely offers the clear guarantees that our security-seeking ego prefers. We are asked to make choices based not on calculated outcomes but on inner authenticity, to trust that following our genuine nature will ultimately serve not only our own development but the larger purposes we are meant to fulfill. This trust must be cultivated gradually through experience, through small experiments in authentic choice that gradually build our confidence in the wisdom of the self's guidance. We might begin by honoring minor promptings, taking a different route to work that leads to an unexpected encounter, signing up for a class that intrigues us despite seeming irrelevant to our career, reaching out to someone we feel drawn to contact despite having no rational reason for doing so. Through such small acts of authentic choice, we begin to develop trust in the deeper intelligence that guides our lives from within. The call to individuation often intensifies during what Jung identified as the transitions of life, those natural passages that mark our movement from one stage of development to another. Adolescence brings the first stirrings of individual identity as we begin to differentiate ourselves from our families of origin. The transition from youth to young adulthood calls us to establish our place in the world, to develop our capacities and claim our independence. The midlife passage, perhaps the most profound of these transitions, summons us to question whether the life we have built truly reflects who we have become, to distinguish between external success and inner fulfillment. Each of these transitions involves what Jung called a process of psychological death and rebirth. Aspects of identity that once felt central to our sense of self must be allowed to die so that new capacities can be born. The adolescent must let go of childhood's dependency to claim adult autonomy. The young adult must release certain dreams of unlimited possibility to commit to specific paths of development. The person in midlife must often sacrifice the illusion of endless time and external validation to pursue what truly matters to their soul. These deaths are never merely losses, but always transformations, endings that create space for new beginnings. Yet they require genuine grief, the willingness to mourn what is being released even as we welcome what seeks to be born. The person beginning to heed the call to individuation must often grieve the simpler life they are leaving behind, the comfortable certainties that must be questioned, the approval that may be withdrawn when others no longer recognize the person they thought they knew. This grieving process is sacred work, for it honors both what has served its purpose and what seeks to emerge. We learn to hold gratitude for the personas that protected us during earlier stages of development, while recognizing that clinging to them now would prevent our continued growth. We appreciate the relationships and roles that provided security and identity, while acknowledging that some may need to be renegotiated or released to make space for our authentic self-expression. The path of individuation leads inevitably through what Jung called the encounter with the shadow. Those aspects of ourselves that we have rejected, denied, or failed to develop. The shadow contains not only our character flaws and shameful impulses, but also our unlived potential, the capacities we dismissed as inappropriate or impossible, the parts of ourselves we sacrificed to gain acceptance or success. True individuation requires reclaiming these disowned aspects, not to act them out unconsciously, but to integrate them consciously into a more complete sense of self. This shadow integration often proves one of the most challenging aspects of the individuation journey, for it asks us to admit that we are far more complex than our carefully maintained self-image suggests. We must acknowledge the anger we thought we had transcended, the needs we convinced ourselves we had outgrown, the dreams we told ourselves were foolish or impractical. Yet this acknowledgement, however humbling, proves ultimately liberating, for it frees the enormous energy we had unconsciously devoted to maintaining these repressions and projections. As we reclaim our shadow, we often discover that what we most feared or rejected in ourselves contains precisely the vitality we need for our next stage of development. The person who spent years suppressing their assertiveness in favor of people-pleasing may find that reclaiming their capacity for healthy anger provides the energy needed to establish necessary boundaries. The individual who rejected their emotional sensitivity as weakness may discover that integrating this capacity enriches their relationships and deepens their creative expression. The individuation process also involves what Jung called the encounter with the anima or animus, the inner figures that represent our relationship to the opposite gender within ourselves. For men, the anima represents the inner feminine qualities of receptivity, intuition, emotional depth, and creative inspiration. For women, the animus embodies the inner masculine capacities for focused thinking, assertive action, and principled discrimination. Individuation requires developing conscious relationship with these inner figures, rather than projecting them unconsciously onto partners or seeking to express them through others. This inner work fundamentally transforms our capacity for relationship, freeing us from the unconscious expectation that others should provide what we have failed to develop in ourselves. The man who has integrated his anima no longer needs a partner to carry all his emotional intelligence. The woman who has claimed her animus no longer requires others to provide her sense of authority or direction. Such integration paradoxically enhances rather than diminishes our capacity for intimate relationship, for we can engage with others from wholeness rather than neediness, offering our complete selves rather than seeking completion through union with another. Throughout this complex process of inner development, the call to individuation maintains its essential character. It is simultaneously deeply personal and utterly transpersonal. While the journey requires us to claim our unique path, it also connects us to the universal human experience of growth, struggle, and transformation. We discover that by becoming more fully ourselves, we participate more completely in the shared, human endeavor of consciousness evolution. This paradox, that the path to authentic individuality leads to deeper connection with universal truths, reflects one of Jung's most profound insights into the nature of human development. The self that calls us toward individuation is not merely a personal psychological structure, but an archetypal reality that connects our individual development to the larger patterns of meaning and purpose that guide human existence. In following our unique path, we serve not only our personal fulfillment, but the collective process through which consciousness itself evolves. The call to individuation, therefore, carries both privilege and responsibility. We are invited to discover and express our unique gifts, to follow the path that calls specifically to our soul. Yet this invitation comes with the obligation to use our discoveries in service of something greater than personal satisfaction. True individuation naturally leads to what Jung called the realization of the self in service, the understanding that our individual development finds its ultimate meaning in contribution to the wholeness of life itself. This service rarely takes the dramatic forms our ego might prefer. We are not all called to be famous teachers, renowned artists, or celebrated leaders. More often, the service that flows from authentic individuation appears in the quiet influence of a life lived with integrity, the healing presence of someone who has done their inner work, the creative contributions of a person expressing their genuine nature. We serve by becoming fully who we are meant to be, trusting that our authentic presence contributes to the collective in ways we may never fully understand. The journey of individuation is not a destination but a process that continues throughout. our lives, deepening and evolving as we mature. Each stage of life brings new aspects of the self-seeking expression, new challenges to our authentic development, new opportunities to align more completely with our essential nature. The person who heeds the call in youth may find it returning with different urgency in midlife, calling them to yet deeper levels of authenticity and service. This ongoing quality of the individuation process means that we never graduate from the need for inner attention, never reach a point where we can coast on previous achievements of self-knowledge. The call continues to evolve, sometimes growing quieter when we are aligned with our path, sometimes intensifying when we have drifted into unconscious patterns or allowed external pressures to override our inner guidance. Learning to maintain ongoing dialogue with this inner voice becomes a lifelong discipline, a form of spiritual practice that keeps us connected to our authentic development. The call to individuation ultimately invites us into a fundamentally different relationship with life itself. Instead of seeing ourselves as victims of circumstances, products of conditioning, or slaves to unconscious patterns, we begin to experience ourselves as conscious participants in our own becoming. We recognize that while we cannot control external events, we always retain the capacity to choose how we respond, to align our responses with our authentic values rather than our unconscious reactions. This shift in perspective transforms not only our relationship to challenges and difficulties, but also our understanding of success and failure. Events that might once have devastated our sense of self-worth are recognized as opportunities for growth, invitations to deeper self-knowledge, chances to practice living from our authentic center rather than our defensive patterns. Achievements that might once have provided complete satisfaction are appreciated, while we remain aware that external validation can never substitute for the inner satisfaction of living in alignment with our true nature. In learning to follow the call to individuation, we gradually develop what might be called psychological sovereignty, the capacity to maintain our authentic center regardless of external pressures or circumstances. This sovereignty is not the rigid independence of the defended ego, but the flexible strength of someone rooted in deep self-knowledge and aligned with transpersonal purposes. We become less reactive to others' expectations and criticisms while remaining genuinely responsive to authentic feedback and guidance. This psychological sovereignty enables us to engage more fully with life because we approach it from authenticity rather than defensiveness. We can afford to be curious about others' perspectives because we are not desperately seeking their approval. We can take appropriate risks because our sense of worth does not depend entirely on successful outcomes. We can offer genuine compassion because we have learned to hold space for our own complexity and contradictions. The call to individuation teaches us that becoming who we are meant to be is not a luxury reserved for those with abundant time and resources, but the essential work of being human. Regardless of our circumstances, we retain the capacity to make choices that honor our authentic nature, to respond to life from our genuine values rather than our unconscious patterns, to participate consciously in our own development. This recognition empowers us even in difficult circumstances, for it reveals that external limitations need not prevent inner growth. As we learn to trust and follow the call to individuation, we often discover that the very qualities that made us feel like outsiders or misfits in earlier stages of life contain precisely the gifts the world needs from us. The sensitivity that made childhood difficult becomes the empathy that enables profound healing work. The rebellious streak that caused problems in school transforms into the innovative thinking that creates necessary change. The intensity that others found overwhelming reveals itself as the passion required to tackle important challenges. This transformation of apparent liabilities into authentic assets reflects the alchemical nature of the individuation process. Like the medieval alchemists who sought to transmute base metals into gold, we discover that the raw material of our neuroses, wounds, and rejected aspects can be transformed through conscious work into the gold of authentic gifts and capacities. Nothing need be wasted in this process. Every aspect of our experience can serve the larger purpose of becoming whole. The call to individuation ultimately reveals life itself as a creative process in which we are simultaneously artist and artwork, sculptor and sculpture, author and character. We are invited to participate consciously in the ongoing creation of who we are becoming, to collaborate with the deeper intelligence of the self in manifesting our unique pattern of wholeness. This collaboration requires both humility and courage. Humility to recognize that we cannot force our development through will alone, and courage to trust and follow the guidance that emerges from our deepest authenticity. In answering the call to individuation, we join the countless souls throughout history who have chosen the difficult but ultimately rewarding path of authentic development. We become part of the great human adventure of consciousness evolution, contributing our unique voice to the collective exploration of what it means to be fully human. This is both the challenge and the gift of individuation, to discover and express our authentic nature in service of something far greater than our personal satisfaction, to become fully ourselves as our contribution to the wholeness of life itself. There is a moment in every soul's journey when the ground beneath our carefully constructed identity begins to shift, when the very qualities we have cultivated most devotedly start to feel hollow, constraining, even alien to our deeper nature. This is not a sign that we have chosen wrongly or lived falsely, but rather the first whisper of what Jung called enantiodromia, the psyche's ancient wisdom that knows when we have traveled too far in one direction and must now swing toward its opposite to restore the sacred balance that wholeness requires. Like a pendulum that has reached the extreme arc of its movement, consciousness cannot remain indefinitely in any single position, no matter how virtuous or successful that position may appear from the outside. The universe itself operates through this principle of dynamic equilibrium, day surrendering to night, seasons cycling through growth and decay, tides flowing in and out in their eternal rhythm. And so it is with the human psyche, which contains its own tidal forces, its own seasonal wisdom that knows when it is time to release what we have been in order to become what we are called to be next. This compensatory movement often arrives disguised as disruption, as an unwelcome intrusion into the well-ordered life we have so carefully constructed. The dedicated executive who has spent decades climbing the corporate ladder suddenly finds herself longing for solitude, for the quiet contemplation she has dismissed as unproductive luxury. The people-pleaser who has made an art form of anticipating others' needs discovers a fierce voice within that refuses to accommodate anyone's comfort at the expense of her own truth. The rational skeptic who has built his worldview on empirical evidence encounters experiences so mysterious, so impossible to categorize, that his entire framework of understanding begins to crack open. In the depths of your psychological landscape, where the familiar territories of consciousness give way to the vast wilderness of the collective unconscious, something ancient stirs. You have arrived at a threshold few recognize, the sacred space where archetypal energies begin to gather, like storm clouds on the horizon of awareness. These are not mere psychological concepts or abstract theories, but living forces that have shaped human experience since the first spark of consciousness illuminated the darkness of primordial existence. The archetype is Jung's great gift to our understanding of the soul's architecture. It is the blueprint that exists before the building, the song that echoes before the instrument learns to play it. When these primal patterns begin to activate in your life, when they constellation with an intensity that can no longer be ignored, you are receiving an invitation written in the language of the gods themselves. This is the archetypal encounter, and it arrives not as a gentle suggestion, but as an imperative from the depths of your being. Perhaps it begins with dreams that feel more real than waking life. You find yourself in the presence of an ancient figure whose eyes hold the wisdom of centuries. The wise old man, the senex, that archetypal energy which carries the accumulated knowledge of all who have walked the path of transformation before you. His appearance is never accidental, never merely the product of an overactive imagination processing the residue of daily experience. When the wise old man emerges from the unconscious, he brings with him the map of your soul's territory, pointing toward passages you had not dared to explore. In your waking hours, you may find yourself inexplicably drawn to older figures, teachers, mentors, even strangers whose presence seems to activate something dormant within you. This is projection in its most sacred form, not the pathological displacement of unconscious material, but the soul's recognition of its own archetypal inheritance. The wise old man is not outside you but within you, waiting to be born through your willingness to embrace the role of guide for your own journey. Or perhaps it is the Great Mother who begins to stir in the depths of your psyche. This is not the personal mother of your childhood, with all her human limitations and psychological complexes, but the eternal feminine principle that governs creation, nurturing, and transformation. When the Great Mother constellation in your life, relationships take on a different quality. You may find yourself becoming a source of nourishment for others in ways that surprise you, or conversely, you may discover an almost desperate hunger for the kind of unconditional acceptance that only the archetypal mother can provide. The appearance of the Great Mother in your inner life often coincides with periods of profound creativity or destruction, for she is the force that gives birth, and the force that devours what has outlived its purpose. In dreams, she may appear as the wise woman in the forest, the queen who rules over hidden realms, or even as the terrible goddess whose embrace means death to the old self and birth to the new. Each manifestation carries within it a specific teaching about your soul's current needs. When you encounter the Great Mother archetype, whether in dreams, relationships, or the sudden flowering of nurturing capacities within yourself, you are being invited to participate consciously in the great cycles of creation and destruction that govern all life. This is not about becoming dependent or infantilized, but about learning to trust the profound wisdom that emerges when we align ourselves with the archetypal patterns that have sustained human life since the beginning of time. The warrior archetype may announce itself through a sudden surge of protective energy, an unexpected willingness to fight for what matters most to you. This is not the aggressive warrior of conquest and domination, but the sacred warrior who serves the self. The one who has learned to distinguish between battles worth fighting and conflicts that merely drain the soul's vitality. When the warrior emerges from the unconscious, it brings with it the fierce clarity that cuts through illusion and the courage to defend what is most precious in your inner life. You may find yourself taking stands that surprise even you, speaking truths that had been locked away in the vault of social propriety, setting boundaries that protect the tender shoots of your emerging selfhood. The warrior's appearance often signals that the time for passive endurance has ended, and the time for conscious engagement with life's challenges has begun. This archetype teaches you to fight not from a place of woundedness or reactive anger, but from a deep commitment to the preservation and expression of your authentic nature. The healer archetype may manifest as an unexplained ability to offer comfort to others, a magnetic attraction to wounded souls, or a sudden understanding of the subtle energies that flow between human beings. When the healer constellation in your psyche, you become a vessel through which the healing wisdom of the collective unconscious can flow into the world. This is not about becoming a professional healer, though it may lead in that direction, but about recognizing your inherent capacity to participate in the restoration of wholeness wherever you encounter fragmentation. The healer teaches you that true healing is not about fixing what is broken, but about creating the conditions in which wholeness can emerge naturally. When this archetype is active, you may find that your mere presence has a calming effect on others, that conflicts resolve more easily in your vicinity, that people feel safe to reveal their deepest vulnerabilities when you are near. This is the healer's gift, the ability to hold space for transformation without forcing or manipulating the process. Each archetypal encounter is a form of initiation, a sacred ordeal that tests your readiness to embody a greater aspect of human potential. Jung understood that these encounters are not merely psychological events, but spiritual summons, calling you to step into more expansive versions of yourself. The archetype does not simply visit you, it seeks to live through you, to find expression in the world through your unique combination of consciousness and circumstance. When the lover archetype activates, it brings with it the capacity for profound connection, not just with another person, but with life itself. This is the energy that dissolves the barriers between self and world, that experiences the universe as an intimate partner in tea, the dance of existence. The lover teaches you to approach life with the vulnerability and passion of one who knows that separation is an illusion and that every encounter is an opportunity for sacred union. The creator archetype may emerge as an irrepressible urge to bring something new into being, whether through art, ideas, or the transformation of existing conditions. When the creator is active, you become a conscious participant in the ongoing creation of the world, understanding that your individual creative acts are expressions of the same force that brought the universe itself into being. This archetype teaches you to trust the creative process even when you cannot see where it is leading, to follow the thread of inspiration into unknown territories. The fool or trickster archetype brings the gift of spontaneity and the willingness to break free from the rigid patterns that constrain authentic expression. When the fool appears in your psychological landscape, it brings permission to experiment, to play, to approach serious matters with lightness and humor. This archetype reminds you that transformation often requires a willingness to appear foolish, to abandon the safety of known strategies and trust the wisdom that emerges through playful exploration. These archetypal encounters are not random, psychological events, but purposeful communications from the deepest layers of the unconscious. They arrive precisely when you are ready to receive their teachings, though readiness is not always a comfortable state of being. The constellation of archetypal energy often feels overwhelming at first, like being struck by lightning or swept away by a flood. The intensity can be frightening because it challenges the ego's illusion of control and confronts you with forces that operate according to their own mysterious logic. Jung recognized that the activation of archetypal energy is both a gift and a responsibility. When you encounter these primordial patterns in your own psyche, you become a bridge between the eternal realm of archetypal possibility and the temporal world of human experience. You are called to embody these energies consciously, to let them work through you without being overwhelmed by their intensity or inflated by their power. The key to navigating archetypal encounters lies in maintaining what Jung called conscious participation. This means recognizing when archetypal energy is at work in your life, understanding its symbolic significance, and finding appropriate ways to honor its expression without being possessed by it. When the wise old man appears, you do not become inflated with grandiose fantasies of your own wisdom, but rather cultivate the humility to receive his teachings and the courage to apply them in your own unique circumstances. When the Great Mother constellates, you do not lose yourself in endless nurturing of others or in infantile dependence on external sources of care, but rather learn to embody the archetypal feminine principle in ways that serve both your own development and the greater wholeness of which you are a part. The sacred marriage between conscious ego and archetypal energy creates a new form of being, one that partakes of eternal wisdom while remaining grounded in the particular circumstances of your individual life. These encounters often occur at crucial transition points in your development, moments when the old forms of identity have become too small to contain the expanding scope of your consciousness. The appearance of archetypal energy signals that you are ready for a new level of responsibility, a deeper engagement with the creative forces of existence. It is as if the universe itself is offering you an upgrade in consciousness, an opportunity to participate more fully in the ongoing creation of reality. The timing of archetypal encounters is never accidental. They arrive when the soil of your consciousness has been prepared through suffering, questioning, and the sincere desire for transformation. The archetype recognizes when you have reached a point of genuine readiness, not the superficial readiness of wishful thinking, but the deep readiness that comes from having exhausted the possibilities of your current level of functioning and being genuinely open to radical change. Sometimes these encounters manifest through relationships with others who seem to embody particular archetypal energies. You meet someone who immediately activates the anima or animus within you, opening doorways to aspects of your own nature that had remained unexplored. Or you encounter a figure who clearly carries the energy of the wise old man or great mother, and through your interaction with them, these same energies begin to stir within your own psyche. It is important to understand that such relationships are not merely personal, but serve an archetypal function. The other person becomes a vessel through which the unconscious can communicate specific teachings about your soul's development. While these relationships can be deeply meaningful and transformative, they require conscious understanding to prevent them from becoming either idealized or devalued when their archetypal function becomes less active. The archetypal encounter is also an encounter with destiny, not destiny as a predetermined fate that strips away your freedom, but destiny as the unique pattern of possibilities that belongs specifically to your individual path of development. When archetypal energies constellation in your life, they reveal aspects of your soul's intended direction, the particular ways in which universal themes are meant to be expressed through your specific combination of gifts, challenges, and circumstances. Jung spoke of the archetype as existing in a state of dynamic tension between the universal and the particular. While the archetypal pattern itself is eternal and unchanging, its manifestation through individual human consciousness is always unique and creative. The warrior archetype that emerges in your psyche will express itself differently than it does in anyone else's, shaped by your personal history, cultural background, and the specific challenges you face in your time and place. This dynamic tension between universal pattern and individual expression is what makes each archetypal encounter a genuine creative act. You are not simply plugging into a preset program, but participating in the ongoing evolution of consciousness itself. Through your conscious engagement with archetypal energy, you contribute something new to the collective human understanding of what it means to embody that particular pattern of being. The purpose of the archetypal encounter is ultimately integration, the conscious assimilation of archetypal energy into the structure of your personality in ways that serve both individual wholeness and collective evolution. This is not about being possessed by archetypal forces or losing yourself in identification with them, but about creating a conscious relationship that allows their wisdom to inform your choices without overwhelming your capacity for discrimination and adaptation. When integration is successful, archetypal energy becomes a reliable source of guidance and empowerment rather than an overwhelming force that disrupts your psychological equilibrium. The warrior within you can be called upon when situations require courage and clear boundaries, but does not dominate your interactions when gentleness and receptivity would be more appropriate. The healer can offer its gifts when healing is needed without compulsively attempting to fix everything and everyone you encounter. As you stand at this threshold of archetypal encounter, you are being invited to expand your understanding of who you are and what you might become. The familiar boundaries of your personality are about to be stretched, perhaps dramatically. New capacities will emerge, unexpected depths will reveal themselves, and you will discover that you are far more than you had previously imagined. This is both thrilling and terrifying. The archetypal realm is vast and powerful, filled with energies that can transform your entire relationship to existence. But it is also your birthright. These patterns live within you not as foreign invaders, but as aspects of your own deepest nature, finally ready to emerge into consciousness. The archetypal encounter is ultimately a homecoming, a return to dimensions of yourself that had been forgotten or suppressed, now ready to be reclaimed and consciously integrated into your evolving sense of self. Trust the process, even when it feels overwhelming. The same intelligence that guides the growth of flowers and the migration of birds is orchestrating this encounter with archetypal energy. Your task is not to control or direct this process, but to participate in it consciously, with courage, humility, and genuine curiosity about what might emerge through this sacred collaboration between your individual consciousness and the eternal, patterns that structure all human experience. The archetypal encounter awaits. Step forward with reverence and readiness. Your soul's deepest wisdom is about to reveal itself through the ancient forms that have guided human transformation since consciousness first gazed upon itself and wondered at the mystery of its own existence. In the deepest caverns of winter, when the landscape of your soul appears barren and lifeless, when every familiar source of meaning has withered beneath the harsh winds of transformation, something miraculous is stirring in the darkness. You cannot see it yet, this secret preparation that the psyche orchestrates in the hidden chambers of consciousness, but like the invisible workings of dormant seeds beneath frozen earth, renewal is already beginning its patient labor. This is the great paradox that Jung discovered in his explorations of the human soul, that periods of apparent desolation, those times when we feel most cut off from the vital springs of existence, are often the very seasons when the deepest healing is taking place. What appears to consciousness as exile from paradise is revealed, in time, to be the necessary journey that allows us to return with eyes that can truly see the treasures we had learned to take for granted. You have wandered far from the garden of your original wholeness. The path that brought you here was not of your choosing, or so it seemed. Loss carved channels through your heart. Disappointment stripped away the comfortable illusions that once made sense of your world, and failure taught you lessons you never wanted to learn. Each step away from innocence felt like punishment, like evidence of some fundamental flaw in your nature or your relationship with existence itself. But now, in this place of apparent exile, you begin to glimpse the deeper intelligence that has been guiding your journey all along. The psyche, that master alchemist Jung came to revere, has been using every apparent defeat as raw material for a transformation you could never have consciously orchestrated. What felt like wandering in the wilderness was actually a curriculum designed by the deepest wisdom of your being, a sacred education that could only take place in the laboratory of lived experience. The garden to which you are returning is not the same garden you left. It could not be, for you are not the same soul who first departed its protective boundaries. The original garden was a place of unconscious wholeness, where opposites had not yet separated into the painful tensions that drive all psychological development. You dwelt there in the paradise of the unexamined life, where questions had not yet formed and contradictions lay sleeping in the fertile darkness of potential. That innocent wholeness had to be lost in order to be found again consciously. The psyche cannot develop its full potential while remaining in the protected sphere of unconscious unity. Like the mythical Adam and Eve, you had to taste the fruit of knowledge, had to experience the painful birth of self-consciousness, had to learn the weight of choice and the burden of responsibility. Only through this exile could you develop the capacity for conscious relationship with the very wholeness you had once embodied without knowing it. Jung understood that the individuation process follows this archetypal pattern of paradise lost and regained. Every genuine transformation requires a journey away from the familiar territories of identity through the wasteland of dissolution toward a new synthesis that incorporates everything that was learned in the darkness. This is not a linear progression, but a spiral path that circles back to earlier themes with ever-deepening understanding. The winter you have been enduring, this psychological season when hope seemed to hibernate and meaning appeared to have migrated to more hospitable climates, has been preparing you for a spring you could never have imagined from within the limitations of your former consciousness. In the depths of apparent barrenness, invisible processes have been working to digest the experiences that once overwhelmed you, to compost the failures that once defined you, to transform the raw material of your suffering into the rich soil from which new life can emerge. This is the secret that nature teaches to those who learn to read her deeper language. The tree that appears dead in winter is not dead, but conserving its energy, drawing its life force back into the hidden places, where essential work can be accomplished without the interference of surface activity. The bulbs buried beneath the snow are not destroyed, but incubating, using the darkness and cold as necessary conditions for the mysterious preparations that will eventually produce flowers of unimaginable beauty. Your psyche has been following this same organic wisdom. While your conscious mind grieved the loss of familiar structures and meanings, deeper layers of your being were quietly reorganizing themselves around a new center of gravity. The apparent death of your old identity was actually the cocoon phase of transformation, a necessary dissolution that creates the space for something entirely new to emerge. Jung called this process enantiodromia, the tendency of things to transform into their opposite when carried to an extreme. The depths of winter naturally give way to the promise of spring. The darkest hour precedes the dawn. The complete breakdown of old forms creates the conditions for breakthrough into unprecedented possibilities. What appears to consciousness as the end of the story is often the hidden beginning of a new chapter that could never have been written within the constraints of the old narrative. The ego, that guardian of continuity and consistency, resists this natural rhythm of death and rebirth. It wants to maintain the familiar structures of identity even when they have become too small to contain the expanding scope of your being. It interprets the dissolution of old forms as evidence of failure rather than recognizing it as the inevitable prelude to growth. The ego cannot see that what it experiences as exile from paradise is actually the preparation for conscious return. But the self, that deeper organizing principle that Jung recognized as the true center of psychological wholeness, orchestrates these cycles of dissolution and renewal with the same intelligence that governs the movement of planets and the migration of birds. The self knows that consciousness must be temporarily disorganized in order to be reorganized at a higher level of complexity and integration. It initiates the winter seasons not as punishment, but as gift, the gift of necessary ending that makes new beginning possible. As you stand on the threshold of this return, you begin to sense the subtle stirrings that announce spring's approach. They are not dramatic or obvious. The first signs of renewal never are. A slight softening in the quality of light, a barely perceptible warmth in the air, the faintest suggestion of movement in the branches that seemed permanently frozen. These are the signals that the long season of dormancy is drawing to a close, and the time of visible growth is about to begin. In your inner landscape, these harbingers of spring manifest as unexpected moments of beauty that catch your attention, fragments of dreams that carry strange new possibilities, sudden insights that illuminate familiar problems from entirely new angles. You find yourself noticing things you had overlooked for months. The way sunlight falls across your wall at a particular time of day, the kindness in a stranger's eyes, the perfect architecture of a flower you had passed countless times without seeing. These are not trivial observations, but profound recognitions. Your capacity to perceive beauty is returning, and with it, your ability to participate in the creative unfolding of existence. The aesthetic sense is one of the first casualties of psychological winter, and one of the first signs of its ending. When you begin to notice beauty again, when ordinary moments begin to reveal their hidden luminosity, you are witnessing the resurrection of your own creative relationship with life. Dreams begin to carry different energies. Where once your sleep was dominated by images of loss, confusion, or threat, now you begin to encounter symbols of growth, renewal, and possibility. Gardens appear in your dreams, not the lost paradise of memory, but new landscapes waiting to be cultivated. Seeds are being planted, ground is being prepared, and you find yourself holding tools you had forgotten you possessed. These dream images are not merely symbolic, but actively participatory. The psyche is using the dream realm to rehearse new ways of being, to experiment with possibilities that have not yet crystallized in waking consciousness. Through dreams, you begin to remember capacities that had been dormant, to reconnect with aspects of yourself that had been temporarily unavailable, to glimpse the outlines of the person you are becoming. Relationships begin to shift as well. People who had seemed indifferent or hostile begin to reflect back a different version of yourself. New individuals enter your life who seem to recognize qualities in you that you had forgotten you possessed. Old relationships either deepen into authentic intimacy or naturally dissolve as their purpose in your development completes itself. The social mirror begins to reflect back the emerging self rather than the self that was in the process of dying. This relational shift is not something you manufacture through effort or strategy. It emerges organically as your inner transformation begins to radiate outward, attracting resonant responses from the field of consciousness in which you participate. Jung understood that individual transformation inevitably affects the collective, that the work you do on yourself sends ripples through the interconnected web of human relationship in ways you may never fully comprehend. The return to the garden is not a regression to previous states of being, but a progression toward integration of everything you have learned during your journey through the wilderness. You bring back with you the hard-won wisdom of experience, the strength that comes from having survived apparent death, the compassion that emerges from intimate knowledge of suffering, and the humility that is born from recognizing the limits of ego-driven striving. This new garden is more beautiful than the one you left because you now have the capacity to appreciate its beauty consciously. You can recognize the intricate interdependence that makes growth possible, the delicate balance between opposing forces that creates dynamic stability, the continuous creativity that manifests as both decay and renewal. What once appeared to be a static paradise is revealed as a living mandala of perpetual transformation. The innocence you lost in your journey away from the garden returns transformed into wisdom. You can once again approach life with the openness and wonder of a child. But now this receptivity is informed by the understanding that comes from having walked through fire and discovered that what you thought would destroy you actually refined you. And this is not naivety, but conscious simplicity, the ability to embrace complexity without being overwhelmed by it, to hold paradox without needing to resolve it prematurely. Jung recognized that this return to the garden represents one of the primary goals of the individuation process, the recovery of wholeness at a new level of consciousness. This is not the unconscious wholeness of the original state, but the conscious wholeness that emerges when all the scattered fragments of the psyche have been gathered up and woven into a new pattern of being that can hold both light and shadow, both human limitation and divine potential. The garden to which you return is not separate from the world of ordinary experience, but reveals itself as the sacred dimension that was always present within the mundane. You do not have to withdraw from engagement with life's practical demands in order to dwell in paradise. Instead, you learn to recognize the garden as the true nature of existence itself, temporarily obscured by the veils of unconsciousness, but always available to those who have developed the eyes to see. This recognition transforms everything while changing nothing. The same activities that once felt burdensome now reveal their hidden significance. The same relationships that once seemed limiting now become vehicles for mutual awakening. The same challenges that once appeared as obstacles now present themselves as opportunities for the continued refinement of consciousness. You discover that you never actually left the garden. You simply forgot how to see it. The psyche's preparation for this recognition has been taking place in the depths of winter's darkness, where consciousness could not interfere with the delicate processes of transformation. Like the alchemical work that Jung studied so intensively, this inner preparation required the sealed container of apparent isolation, the controlled temperature of sustained attention, and the patient endurance of processes that could not be rushed or forced. Now the vessel is opening. The great work of transformation is ready to reveal its fruits. What was dissolved in the solve phase of the alchemical process is now ready to coagulate into new forms of being. The prima materia of raw experience has been refined into the philosopher's stone of integrated consciousness, not as a permanent achievement, but as a living capacity that continues to evolve and mature. The return to the garden is not an ending, but a new beginning. You discover that every return is simultaneously a departure, that every arrival contains within it the seeds of the next journey. The garden itself is not a static destination, but a dynamic field of creative potential that continues to unfold through your conscious participation in its ongoing creation. This is perhaps the deepest teaching of the return, that paradise is not a place you go to, but a quality of consciousness you bring to wherever you are. The garden exists wherever awareness recognizes its own creative nature, wherever love discovers its own reflection in the world of form, wherever the individual's soul realizes its essential unity with the cosmic self that manifests as all existence. You stand now at the threshold of this recognition, prepared by your journey through psychological winter to receive the gift of conscious spring. The barren landscapes of your recent past are beginning to show the first tender shoots of new growth. Trust this process. Allow the natural wisdom of the psyche to orchestrate the timing of renewal. Your task is not to force the flowers to bloom, but to tend the garden of awareness with the patience and devotion of one who has learned to recognize the sacred in the ordinary, the eternal in the temporal, the infinite in the intimate. The return to the garden awaits. But know that you carry this garden with you wherever you go, for you have discovered that paradise is not a place you lost long ago, but the very ground of being that supports every moment of existence. Welcome home to the garden that was never separate from the gardener, the wholeness that was never separate from the one who seeks wholeness, the love that was never separate from the lover who thought love had been lost. In this return, you complete the circle while beginning the spiral. The garden welcomes you not as a prodigal child returning to what was lost, but as a conscious gardener ready to participate in the ongoing creation of paradise on earth. This is the true meaning of psychological spring, not the recovery of what was, but the discovery of what can be when human consciousness aligns itself with the creative intelligence that moves in all things, through all things, as all things. The secret preparation is complete. The season of visibility begins now. At the summit of your long journey through the labyrinth of consciousness, where all paths converge and all paradoxes resolve into a higher synthesis, you arrive at the most sacred threshold of human development, the alchemical wedding. This is not a ceremony that takes place in the external world, though it may be reflected there, but the profound inner marriage between all the opposing forces that have been warring within your psyche since consciousness first divided itself into the polarities of existence. Jung envisioned this moment as the culmination of the individuation process, the sacred union that births the self in its fullness, that integrated personality which can hold paradox without breaking, which can embrace both human frailty and divine potential as equally sacred aspects of wholeness. Here, in this most intimate chamber of the soul, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, spirit and matter finally cease their eternal struggle and discover their essential unity. You have been preparing for this wedding since the moment you first began to question the simple certainties of childhood, though you could not have known it then. Every conflict you have endured between opposing aspects of your nature, every painful tension between what you desired and what you believed you should desire, every moment when you felt torn between competing loyalties or contradictory truths, all of this has been the courtship dance that precedes the alchemical marriage. The ancient alchemists, those proto-psychologists whom Jung studied with such devotion, encoded this process in their elaborate symbolic texts. They spoke of the sacred marriage between Sol and Luna, the union of sulfur and mercury, the conjunction of opposites that produces the philosopher's stone. But their real laboratory was consciousness itself, and their great work was the transformation of the divided psyche into the integrated self. This wedding cannot be arranged by the ego, cannot be forced through willpower or achieved through technique. It emerges naturally when consciousness has been sufficiently refined, when the opposing forces within have been acknowledged, honored, and gradually brought into dialogue with one another. The alchemical wedding is always a gift of grace, the spontaneous flowering of wholeness, when all the conditions for its emergence have been met. Within your psyche, the masculine and feminine principles have been engaged in an elaborate dance of separation and approach, conflict and reconciliation. The masculine, that energy of focus, discrimination, penetration and directed will, has often seemed at odds with the feminine principle of receptivity, intuition, nurturing, and cyclical wisdom. You may have identified more strongly with one than the other, developing it at the expense of its complement, creating an inner imbalance that manifested as restlessness, dissatisfaction, or a sense of something essential missing from your life. The sacred marriage begins when these two aspects of your nature stop competing for dominance and start recognizing each other as essential partners in the creation of wholeness. The inner masculine learns to value the wisdom that comes through receptivity and feeling, while the inner feminine embraces the clarity that emerges through discrimination and focused intention. Neither seeks to dominate or eliminate the other, but each offers its gifts in service of a greater unity. This is not about gender in the conventional sense, though it may be reflected in how you relate to gender in yourself and others. Every human psyche contains both masculine and feminine principles regardless of biological sex or gender identity. The alchemical wedding is the integration of these archetypal energies within the individual soul, creating a new form of being that transcends the limitations of one-sided development. When the masculine and feminine unite within you, you discover capacities you never knew you possessed. You can be both strong and tender, both decisive and receptive, both protective and nurturing. You no longer feel compelled to choose between competing aspects of your nature, but learn to express whichever energy serves the highest good in any given moment. This is true flexibility, not the weakness of having no center, but the strength of having such a secure center that you can afford to be fluid in your expressions. Simultaneously, the long war between consciousness and the unconscious begins to resolve into a new form of collaboration. The conscious mind, with its capacity for analysis, planning, and directed action, learns to respect the profound intelligence that emerges from unconscious processes. Dreams are no longer dismissed as meaningless random activity, but recognized as communications from the deeper layers of the psyche. Intuitions are not overridden by rational analysis, but the wedding chamber of consciousness in which this sacred marriage takes place is not separate from the world of ordinary experience, but transforms that world from within. Paradise is not regained by escaping Earth, but by recognizing Earth itself as paradise when seen through the eyes of integrated consciousness. The kingdom of heaven is not a distant realm, but the quality of awareness that emerges when all aspects of your being are united in service of wholeness. Stand now in the presence of this sacred union, witness to the marriage of all that you have been and all that you are becoming. The ceremony is eternal, continuously renewed with each moment of conscious integration. The bride and groom are aspects of your own being, finally ready to pledge their eternal cooperation in the ongoing creation of your authentic life. Speak now your vows to wholeness, your commitment to honoring both the light and shadow aspects of your nature, your promise to serve the highest good through the fullest expression of your integrated being. Let this inner marriage be the foundation for all your relationships, the ground from which you engage with the challenges and opportunities of existence. The alchemical wedding is complete, and the real work begins now, the work of living as an integrated being in a world that desperately needs examples of what wholeness looks like in action. Go forth as a married soul, wedded to your own completeness, and let this inner union bless everything you touch with the transformative power of love made conscious. There comes a moment in the soul's journey when the frantic searching ceases, not because the destination has been reached, but because the seeker finally recognizes that they were never truly lost. Like a child who has wandered far from home only to discover they were walking in circles around the very garden where they began, consciousness awakens to the profound truth that what we sought in the distance was always present in the depths, waiting not to be found, but to be remembered. This is the great paradox of individuation, that in our most desperate attempts to escape ourselves, we are actually being drawn deeper into the mystery of who we are. Every wrong turn becomes a sacred detour, every moment of confusion a necessary pause in the eternal dance between ego and self, between the part of us that believes it must control the journey and the deeper wisdom that knows the path unfolds exactly as it must. Jung understood this sacred pattern, this rhythm of departure and return that pulses through every authentic life like a cosmic heartbeat. He saw that psychological growth is never a straight line toward some imagined perfection, but rather a spiral dance, where we circle again and again through the same essential themes, each time at a deeper level, each revolution bringing us closer to the center of our being while simultaneously expanding our capacity to embrace the whole. The soul that once felt abandoned by meaning now recognizes itself as the eternal wanderer, not cursed to roam, but blessed to explore, not lost, but free, moving through the landscape of consciousness with the curious delight of one who has finally understood that the journey itself is home. Every step becomes sacred when we realize we are not walking toward something but dancing with something, not pursuing truth, but being pursued by it, drawn ever deeper into the mystery that we ourselves are. In this recognition, the old anxiety dissolves like morning mist before the rising sun. The urgent need to arrive somewhere specific, to achieve some final state of enlightenment or completion, reveals itself as another form of spiritual materialism, another way the ego tries to turn the infinite into something it can possess and control. But consciousness, matured through its wanderings, has learned to trust the intelligence that moves through uncertainty, the wisdom that navigates by feeling rather than by map. This is the gift of having been truly lost, not the surface confusion, of missing a turn or forgetting a detail, but the deep existential lostness that strips away all familiar landmarks and leaves us standing naked in the void of not knowing. For it is only in this radical not knowing that we discover the part of ourselves that was never confused, never lost, never in doubt about which way to go. The self, that transpersonal center of being that Jung recognized as our true guide, emerges not as a consolation prize for having wandered, but as the very intelligence that orchestrated the wandering in the first place. Every crisis of direction, we now understand, was actually a redirection, a way of steering us away from the paths that would have kept us small and toward the experiences that would crack us open to our larger being. What felt like cosmic indifference or even cruelty was actually cosmic love, the fierce tenderness of a universe that refuses to let us settle for anything less than our full awakening, even when we beg to be allowed to remain asleep. The ego, that faithful but limited servant of consciousness, slowly learns to bow before this greater wisdom. No longer does it insist on being the navigator of the soul's journey. Having been humbled by its own inadequacy in the face of the truly mysterious, having discovered that its careful plans and desperate strategies only created more suffering, it begins to serve a different function, not as the director of the inner journey, but as its conscious witness, not as the one who chooses the path, but as the one who pays attention to what unfolds along the way. This shift represents a fundamental reorientation of the psyche, what Jung called the transcendence of the ego-self axis. The ego does not disappear. That would be psychosis, not individuation. But it takes its proper place in the hierarchy of inner authority. Like a skilled sailor who learns to work with the wind rather than against it, the mature ego learns to collaborate with the deeper currents of the self, adding its unique gifts of consciousness and discrimination to the service of a wisdom far greater than its own. In this collaboration, something beautiful emerges that was impossible when either ego or self tried to operate alone. The ego, freed from the impossible burden of having to guide a journey it was never equipped to navigate, discovers its true genius lies in articulation, in bringing the wordless wisdom of the self into language and form. The self, no longer having to shout over the ego's anxious chatter to make itself heard, can speak in the subtle whispers and gentle promptings that are its natural voice. This is the marriage Jung spoke of, the hieros gamos, or sacred wedding, between the conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche, not a merger that obliterates the distinctness of each partner, but a dance that honors both the ego's clarity and the self's mystery, both the mind's need to understand and the heart's capacity to simply be with what is. From this union is born what we might call the integrated personality, not perfect, for perfection belongs to the realm of ideas, not to the messy, beautiful complexity of actual human existence, but whole. Whole in the sense of including rather than excluding, of embracing the full spectrum of what it means to be human, rather than trying to edit out the parts that make us uncomfortable. The shadow, once feared as the enemy of spiritual progress, is recognized as an essential aspect of wholeness, not something to be eliminated, but something to be integrated with consciousness and compassion. The parts of ourselves we once disowned, the anger, the sadness, the confusion, the imperfection, are welcomed home like prodigal children, their energy no longer turned against us, but available for the service of our authentic expression. This integration is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing process, a daily practice of remembering who we are beneath the roles we play and the stories we tell about ourselves. It requires what Jung called a moral attitude, not moralism with its rigid rules and harsh judgments, but an ethical stance rooted in honesty, humility, and the recognition that we are far more complex and mysterious than we often allow ourselves to acknowledge. Every day brings new opportunities to practice this remembering, new invitations to choose integration over fragmentation, wholeness over perfectionism, truth over the comfortable lies that keep us small. The morning's irritation with traffic becomes a chance to meet our impatience with compassion. The afternoon's disappointment with a colleague becomes an opportunity to explore what we're expecting from others that we haven't yet learned to give ourselves. The evening's loneliness becomes a doorway into the solitude where we can commune with the deeper sources of connection that don't depend on external validation. In this way, ordinary life becomes the arena of individuation, not something we must escape from in order to grow, but the very medium through which growth occurs. The spiritual journey is no longer about transcending human existence, but about descending more fully into it, bringing the light of consciousness into every corner of our experience, illuminating with presence what we once tried to avoid through distraction or denial. This is perhaps the most radical understanding that emerges from the journey through lostness and back into belonging, that there is nowhere to go because we are already here, nothing to achieve because we are already whole, nothing to become because we are already what we seek. The goal is not to reach some future state of enlightenment, but to recognize the enlightenment that is always already present, hidden only by our beliefs about what enlightenment should look like. The eternal return, then, is not about going backward, but about going deeper, not about repeating the past, but about discovering the timeless patterns that connect all experience into a meaningful whole. We return again and again to the same essential questions. Who am I? What am I here for? How shall I live? Not because we failed to answer them the first time, but because these questions have layers of meaning that reveal themselves only through lived experience, only through the actual testing of our understanding against the complexity of real life. Each time we circle back, we bring with us the wisdom earned through our wanderings, the compassion developed through our mistakes, the humility learned through our failures. We are the same person asking the same questions, yet we are also utterly transformed, approaching the eternal mysteries from a place of depth and maturity that was impossible at the beginning of the journey. This spiral nature of growth reflects one of Jung's most profound insights, that consciousness develops not through linear progression, but through what he called the transcendent function, a process by which seemingly opposite aspects of experience are held in creative tension until a new synthesis emerges that includes and transcends both. The ego's need for control and the self's invitation to surrender, the longing for certainty and the acceptance of mystery, the desire for independence and the recognition of our deep interconnectedness. These are not problems to be solved, but paradoxes to be lived, tensions that generate the energy necessary for continued growth and transformation. Living in this creative tension requires what Jung called holding the opposites, the capacity to remain present with conflicting aspects of experience without immediately rushing to resolve the discomfort through premature closure or false certainties. This is perhaps the most challenging skill of individuation, requiring us to develop what Keats called negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainty and doubt without irritably reaching after fact and reason. Yet this capacity for holding paradox is also what allows us to become truly helpful to others who are struggling with their own journeys through uncertainty and doubt. Having learned to be present with our own confusion without needing to fix it immediately, we can offer the same quality of presence to those around us. We become, in Jung's beautiful phrase, wounded healers, not people who have transcended suffering, but people who have learned to suffer consciously, transforming their pain into wisdom and their struggles into strength that can be offered in service to others. This is how the individual journey of individuation serves the larger, collective process of human consciousness evolution. Each person who learns to live from their authentic center, who integrates their shadow and follows their unique path of unfolding, adds to the sum total of consciousness available to our species. The work we do on ourselves ripples outward in ways we cannot always see, contributing to the gradual awakening of humanity to its fuller potential. Jung understood this connection between individual and collective transformation, recognizing that the fate of civilization depends not on external changes in social structures or technological advances, but on the inner work done by individuals willing to take responsibility for their own psychological development. The world hangs on a thin thread, he wrote, and that thread is the psyche of man. This understanding brings with it both tremendous responsibility and tremendous hope. Responsibility because we can no longer imagine that our inner work is merely personal, that our struggles with depression or anxiety or anger affect only ourselves. Everything we think and feel and do contributes to the collective human experience, adding either to the sum of consciousness and compassion in the world or to the total of unconsciousness and suffering. But this responsibility is balanced by hope, because it means that no one's efforts toward greater wholeness and authenticity are ever wasted. Even the seemingly small daily choices to tell the truth, to act with kindness, to meet our own darkness with compassion rather than judgment, participate in the larger healing of our world. Every moment of genuine presence, every act of courageous vulnerability, every choice to love rather than fear, adds light to what often feels like an overwhelming darkness. The eternal return, from this perspective, is not just an individual psychological pattern but a cosmic principle, the way the universe itself grows and learns and evolves through the endless cycles of manifestation and dissolution, creation and destruction, forgetting and remembering. We are not separate from this cosmic process, but intimate participants in it, each of our lives a unique expression of the universe's desire to know itself more fully. In recognizing ourselves as expressions of this cosmic creativity, we find both the humility and the dignity that Jung saw as essential to psychological maturity. Humility because we understand that we are small parts of something infinitely larger than ourselves, not the center of existence but temporary focal points through which existence knows itself. Dignity because we recognize that our individual experience, however mundane it might seem, participates in the sacred process by which consciousness awakens to its own nature. This shift in perspective transforms everything. Work becomes a form of service rather than mere survival. Relationships become opportunities for mutual awakening rather than arenas for getting our needs met. Challenges become invitations to grow rather than problems to be solved. Even our failures and mistakes become valuable data in the ongoing experiment of being human, information that helps us calibrate our compass and adjust our course. The eternal return reveals itself not as repetition, but as deepening recognition. Not as going in circles, but as spiraling toward greater clarity and compassion. Each time, we encounter a familiar challenge or revisit an old pattern. We have the opportunity to meet it from a place of greater wisdom and integration. The same trigger that once sent us into hours or days of reactivity might now be met with a moment of pause and a conscious choice about how to respond. This is not about becoming invulnerable or transcending our humanity, but about becoming more skillful humans, more conscious participants in our own experience. We still feel the full range of human emotions, still encounter obstacles and disappointments, still grapple with uncertainty and loss. But we meet these experiences with the kind of presence that transforms suffering into meaning, confusion into curiosity, and isolation into solitude. The wanderer, who has learned to trust the path even when it leads through darkness, carries within themselves a quality of being that is itself a form of guidance for others, not because they have all the answers. True wisdom knows it doesn't, but because they have learned to live the questions, to dance with uncertainty, to find meaning in the journey itself rather than waiting for some final destination to provide. This quality of being becomes a gift to everyone they encounter, a reminder that it's possible to live with an open heart even in a world that often seems designed to close us down, to maintain curiosity even when faced with complex challenges that have no easy solutions, to choose love even when fear seems more practical. The eternal return, ultimately, is the return to love, not as a sentiment or emotion, but as the fundamental orientation of consciousness that recognizes its own nature in everything it encounters. This love is not always comfortable or easy. Sometimes it requires fierce boundaries, difficult conversations, or the courage to disappoint others in service of a deeper truth. But it is always present as the underlying motivation, the desire to serve the highest good rather than the ego's preferences. In this love, the journey of individuation finds its completion and its new beginning. For love, like consciousness, is not a destination but a way of traveling, not a goal to be achieved, but a reality to be lived. The soul that has learned to love itself, not in the narcissistic sense of self-aggrandizement, but in the sense of profound self-acceptance and commitment to its own growth, naturally extends that same quality of love to the world around it. This extension happens not through effort but through overflow, like a spring that feeds the surrounding landscape simply because it cannot help but give what it contains. The person who has done the work of integration becomes a source of healing presence in the world, not because they try to fix or change others, but because their very being demonstrates that it's possible to be human with dignity and grace. Eternal return reveals that this demonstration is perhaps our greatest gift to the world, not our achievements or accomplishments, but our willingness to be authentic examples of conscious living, imperfect but sincere attempts to embody the values we hold dear. In a world often dominated by pretense and performance, genuine authenticity becomes a radical act, a form of rebellion against the forces that would have us remain small and unconscious. And so the journey continues, not towards some imagined perfection, but deeper into the mystery of what it means to be alive, to be conscious, to participate in the great work of awakening that is always happening, whether we're aware of it or not. The eternal return is the recognition that this awakening is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be lived, not a destination to reach, but a way of traveling that transforms every step into a homecoming, every breath into a prayer, every moment into an opportunity to begin again. In this beginning again, in this eternal return to presence and possibility, the soul finds what it was always seeking, not escape from the human condition, but the capacity to meet that condition with such wholeness and compassion that it becomes transfigured from burden into gift, from obstacle into opportunity, from suffering into service. This is the ultimate fruit of the journey through lostness and back into belonging, the discovery that we were never truly lost because we were always held by a love too vast to comprehend, too intimate to doubt, too present to need finding, because it is the very ground of our being, the source from which we arise and to which we eternally return.